Watch this vidcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Welcome back, horror hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I'm James Rivera. We have a special guest with us today. His name is Secret Sergio.
Hey guys, thanks so much for having me.
And that, of course, isn't his real name. He doesn't want to give his real name. He is a therapist. And we won't go into too much detail of what field he's in, but he is a therapist and he's very good at what he does. And we're hopefully soon going to put a podcast together where we talk to him about the effect of horror films on the psyche and what he's been taught and how much of it is propaganda.
Most of it.
So we thought a great introduction to Secret Sergio would be our top 10 horror films of the decade, of the past decade.
Well, thank you both so much for having me. And I think you're going to see, too, me being a therapist probably informs a lot of my list. Okay. You'll start to see a theme emerge, I'm sure.
So do you want to kick it off by giving 10 more honorable mentions on your list, Mr. Michael?
I don't think James put his in order, but I put mine in somewhat of an order. So I gave my first 10 honorable mentions this last week, and I'm going to give my second group of 10 this week. And what James and I are going to do, when we each give our next 10 honorable mentions, we're going to catch you up on our 20 through 11 from last week. So let's get started. My next honorable mention for this week is The Endless from 2017. I love this film, directed by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, and they also wrote it. Actually, it was written by Justin Benson, and they did both Spring and Resolution. It's a somewhat of a sequel to Resolution about two adult brothers who escaped an alien death cult when they were kids, and a strange videotape from the cult leads them back to it to get answers. It involves time loops, hypnotizing dialogue, and a masterful mindfuck toward the end.
Excellent movie.
My next honorable mention is Get Out, 2017, written and directed
Honorable mention?
Yeah.
By Jordan Peele. I wanted this in the top 20, but it didn't quite make it. But I thought it was riveting, well-written and well-crafted, great acting, and a phenomenal debut that showed the characteristics of a master in Jordan Peele. Something that was flat for me on Us, but it still made me excited for what else he did. Next.
All right.
My next honorable mention is my favorite film from last year, Bliss, 2019, written and directed by Joe Begos, who did Almost Human and Mind's Eye, and he just did VFW, just came out. It's a stylistic thrill ride full of drama, blood, guts, and action. It starts out realistic and gradually spirals into a gory psychedelic nightmare, and I absolutely loved it. My next honorable mention is Incident in a Ghostland from 2018, written and directed by Pascal Laugier, who did Martyrs. It's violent, emotional, and disturbing, atmospheric, and ambiguous for much of the film. It's creepy and menacing horror villains with a bit of an unexpected mindfuck on this one, too, toward the end. My next one, I really wanted to put this in the top 20, but didn't make it either. The Funhouse Massacre, 2015. I'm so happy I discovered this last year, directed by Andy Palmer. It stars Robert Englund and an interesting and colorful cast of horror villains. It's also a fun and interesting cast of victims, which is important for me in a movie like this. And for me, it's the best horror in a haunted attraction I've ever seen. It's underrated and underseen, a lot of fun. My next one is Cam. That was one of my favorite horror films from 2018, directed by Daniel Goldhaber and co-written by former Cam girl Issa Maze. Another found footage film from 2014, Creep, directed and co-written by Patrick Bryce and co-written by Mark Duplass, and they both star in it as well. My next one, another one I couldn't believe didn't make it into the top 20, Starry Eyes from 2014, written and directed by Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer, and another wild performance by a female actress in horror, Alex Esso. This was a star-making performance for me. It's amazing descent into madness and evil. I loved it. My next honorable mention is I Saw the Devil from 2010, written and directed by Ji Woon Kim. It's gory and original action revenge horror film from South Korea. And pretty close to a masterpiece for me, that one was.
But not close enough for your top 20.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it was disturbing and gory, but it wasn't horror enough to make it into my top 20.
It was just a great decade for films from South Korea.
Yes, it was.
And then my last honorable mention is another found footage film, The Den from 2013, written and directed by Zachary Donahue. And it stars another wild performance from a female actress in horror, Melanie Papalia. I can't wait to see what else she does. It's genuinely bone-jarringly scary. And I'll catch you up on my list from last week. My number 20 was Tigers Are Not Afraid, written and directed by Issa Lopez. 19 was Wormwood, Road of the Dead, written and directed by Cla Roach Turner from Australia. My number 18 was The Collection, directed and co-written by Marcus Dunstan and co-written by Patrick Melton. My number 17 was directed and co-written by Fede Alvarez, Don't Breathe from 2016. And my number 16 was Mandy, directed and co-written by Panos Cosmatos. My number 15 was It Follows, written and directed by David Robert Mitchell. 14 was Your Next, directed by Adam Wingard and written by Simon Barrett. Number 13, Frozen, written and directed by Adam Green. Absolutely love that film. And my number 12 was Insidious, directed by James Wan and written by the great Lee Whannell. Love that guy. And my number 11 was The Lighthouse, directed by Robert Eggers and co-written with Max Eggers, his brother.
You know, I'm usually not so critical of the opinions of others, but I kind of want to send you to the sunken place for leaving out Get Out. I just can't get over that one.
I was actually pretty shocked that that's only in your honorable mentions, but I'll get started with mine. My first honorable mention is The Devil's Candy, directed by Sean Byrne, one of the best horror metal movies. My next honorable mention is VHS 2, excellent found footage movie that surpasses the original one, which I actually like. My next one is Michael's favorite, the Evil Dead remake from Fede Alvarez. One of my favorite remakes. I know a lot of people hate it. I'm not one of them. My next honorable mention is Sinister from director Scott Derrickson. I'm surprised this actually didn't make it into my top 20. My next honorable mention is another one I'm surprised didn't make it into my top 20. It's Insidious, directed by James Wan. My next honorable mention is Tigers Are Not Afraid from Issa Lopez. My next honorable mention is The Curse of Chucky from the series creator Don Mancini. My next honorable mention is Midsommar from Ari Aster. Then my next one is Goodnight Mommy from Severin Fiala and Veronica Franz. I hope I didn't butcher those names. My last honorable mention is probably going to upset Michael that it didn't make it into my top 20 is The Conjuring 2, directed by James Wan.
How dare you?
By the way, these honorable mentions are in order. So it just skirted outside my top 20. So recounting last week's top 20, I started with I Saw the Devil, the South Korean film from Kim Ji-woon. Next one was Black Swan from Darren Aronofsky at 19. My number 18 was Red State from Kevin Smith. My number 17 is one of Sergio's favorites, Mandy.
Oh, gosh.
I'm just kidding.
I was trying not to bring that up.
My next honorable mention is The Eyes of My Mother from... Not honorable mention, god damn it. My number 16 is The Eyes of My Mother from director Nicholas Pesci. Excellent black and white horror movie. At number 15, I had Starry Eyes from Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer. My number 14 was The Girl with All the Gifts, the British zombie film from Cole McCarthy. My number 13 was the Suspiria remake directed by Luca Guadagnino. My number 12 was The Lighthouse from Robert Eggers. And we've blabbed so much about this movie, I don't want to talk any more about it.
I will.
Okay. Well, you'll give a fresh perspective. And my number 11, I was surprised this did not crack my top 10, was It Follows from director David Robert Mitchell. One of the key horror films of the 2010s.
Well, let me just clear the air really quickly. I don't want to be a first-time guest here and have everyone hate me already.
No, we want your honesty.
Bringing up that I wasn't a fan of Mandy. I'm not a big fan of the big psychedelic hallucinatory type films. I see it's very, very well made. It was an incredibly crafted film. It's just not my jam. So hopefully half the people who hated me stopped hating me with that explanation.
That's okay.
I doubt it. Alrighty, so we're getting into my honorable mentions. Again, I'm coming in and I'm switching everything up. I have a couple categories. So the first one is documentary, and I have to mention Horror Noir from 2019, directed by Xavier Bergen. I actually went to the premiere of this at the Egyptian, and they had this great panel afterward, and it was just so eye-opening in regards to how Black people have experienced horror or not experienced horror. And what I probably love most about the film too is it opened my eyes to so many films I wasn't familiar with, like Ganja and Hess, and it made me go back and revisit films that I already loved and just look at them through a different lens, like Candyman or even Get Out. Next, I want to give a shout out to a couple television shows. So, The Haunting of Hill House by Mike Flanagan, which is an adaptation of Shirley Jackson's story, I think was huge.
If that were a film, like a really long film, it would have made my top 10, possibly my top 5. So I love that show.
Absolutely, and I had to bring it up for that reason too, because I think it was huge for just the horror renaissance we're experiencing and bringing people into the mainstream.
I saved my Mike Flanagan choices for some regular feature-length films, but that's probably his best work to date, though.
I agree, definitely. And then my second television choice is American Horror Story, just as a series. I think it came out in 2011, of course, made by Ryan Murphy. Yeah. I really believe that this show in itself was what brought a lot of people from the mainstream into horror this decade and what really made people excited for horror.
I agree with you because it's strange. My mom is not really into horror. Mm-hmm. I mean, she only likes classic horror or only will watch them around like Halloween time. It's the only time she watches horror movies, but she loves American Horror Story.
And it's so divisive. And
it is.
But it's weird that there's no certain season that all the fans agree on. All the fans have all different favorite seasons.
I think that's the result of making a show that's so wildly different. I always say this. I feel like every season they throw everything and the kitchen sink at the concept that they're doing. So it doesn't always work for me, but for the most part, it actually does work for me. There's only like 1 or 2 seasons that I don't really care for.
Yeah, same for me. And even just the fact that it's divisive shows what a huge cultural impact that it's had. It gets people excited enough to want to debate about it, argue about it, talk about it.
And I can't believe it was put out by the same guy who brought Glee.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, as divisive as it is, as much shit is talked about it, its ratings remain really good year after year. It always does well for FX.
Yeah, that it does. So that was my television shout-outs. And now I think... it's worth mentioning this was a good decade for Christmas horror.
Yeah, it was.
I have a few Christmas choices that I want to give a shout out to. So the first one, of course, is All the Creatures Were Stirring, 2018 from Dave and Rebecca McKendry.
Yes, I love that one.
Yes.
This is one that I see it's going to be like a Christmas staple. Like every Christmas season, every holiday season, it's going to be one I go back to and introduce people to. It was just so much fun. The second one was Krampus, 2015.
Oh, Michael loves that one.
Do you not like Krampus?
I didn't like that.
I liked Krampus. We actually went to go see that for his birthday, like a few years back, and I think all of us enjoyed it. And I was like, "Yeah, that was good." I think Michael's the only one on his birthday who walked out not liking the movie.
Because my expectations were through the roof. I was like, he did the definitive Halloween movie. Now he's going to do the definitive Christmas horror. And it just wasn't that for me, especially because I love Adam Scott and I love Toni Collette. It just didn't work for me.
And it was your birthday, which makes it doubly disappointing.
Yeah.
I liked it, though.
Yeah, I just thought it was so much fun. It was so much fun, and Toni Collette's awesome. And I really like Dave Koechner in it, too. I think he's a great comedic actor.
Yeah.
So it really worked for me in that sense. I saw it for the first time, actually, like a year or two ago with our friend Newt, and we just had a blast watching it. And if I have that much fun watching a film, it's good enough for me.
Yeah, I need to rewatch that one. I need to manage my expectations this time.
So now we're getting to my regular honorable mentions. The first one, and I can't believe this didn't make it. I was trying to stuff it in the top 10. It wouldn't work. One Cut of the Dead, 2017, directed by Shinichiro Ueda.
One of the best from last year.
It was amazing.
Unquestionably.
And this is something I really like about films. It was one of those that just kept me guessing the entire time. Yeah. And we can't give it away, but the big reveal...
As the movie goes along, it keeps resetting the audience expectations of what it's supposed to be or what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just constantly reinventing itself like every 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
And it's done by students.
Yeah.
And all the actors actually paid to be in it because they were paying for the course that they were in.
And things that initially seem like flaws begin to crystallize and become more deliberate as the movie goes on.
And I really enjoy that in a film too, where maybe while I'm watching it, I'm looking at the flaws and I'm like picking things apart, but at the end it all comes together and it all makes sense and it's all perfect.
It makes it perfect for rewatches.
Absolutely. My next one is Raw from 2016.
Ooh, good choice.
Yeah, this is a tough one not to have in there too. So again, it was just one of those films that caught me off guard. It was incredibly novel. It was really disturbing. It's not quite part of the French extremism movement, but it seems like it's kind of like the post-French extremism.
But I feel like the fact that it holds back,
yeah,
when you think it's not going to, makes it more uncomfortable.
It was a slow build-up, and just the transformation that you see her going through, and then eventually seeing what she does, what she's capable of. I did think that was so effective, and I do like that they held back a lot on that.
Yeah, the Rabbit remake had a similar premise, but it was done so much better in Raw. So much better.
I haven't seen that one yet.
Well,
I heard what you both said about it.
Form your own opinions.
I will. My next one is It Follows from 2014. This is another one that I'm surprised didn't make it in my top 10.
I think it surprised all of us that none of us have It Follows in our top 10. And it seems like it would be such a natural choice.
Right, it had everything. It had everything I'm looking for. It had great creature design. It had a great concept. It was novel. It was new. And the criticism it gets, I don't really agree with. A lot of people say it doesn't really follow its own rules. But that's
like Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah, that's what I like.
Are you challenging Tarantino?
I'm not challenging. Yes,
I'm just
challenging Tarantino.
I mean, it somewhat set up rules, but I don't think they were hardline rules. They were just speculating on what it could be. You don't actually know what this thing is and it's capable of, so I don't think it broke rules at all. I didn't really get that complaint.
And at the end of the day, they're teenagers.
Yeah.
So I remember being a teenager and having all these myths and legends and whatnot, and it was never consistent. So I thought that added to the realism of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably the best jump scare of the decade, with the tall man walking through the door. Scared the fuck out of me when I first saw it.
Shut up.
That was probably my second favorite scare of the decade. I'll get to my number one later.
All right.
My next one's from 2015, Hell House LLC.
So good.
I love this film, and I love the series. I think all three are pretty solid. And what I like most about it is with this one and with Creep, which I might mention later on, it just really reinvigorated my interest in the found footage genre in general. We had a lot of good found footage this decade, but I think Hell House LLC was one that caught everyone by surprise, and it was really refreshing.
Yeah, something interesting happened with that one. I really enjoyed it, and then it got to the climax that I was waiting for the whole movie, and I thought it kind of fell apart and got jumbled and confusing.
I had the same reaction to it.
But then when I watched it again and seeing how it was crafted, I really enjoyed it. So it just took me a second viewing to really get what was going on in that final scene, and once you get it, it's pretty scary.
Definitely. My next one is Midsommar 2019 from Ari Aster.
How do we say this right? Midsommar, or is it Midsummer?
I think it's said both ways.
It
So
could be said either way.
I heard an interview with Ari Aster, and he said kind of both. He said it's Midsummer, but he knows other people pronounce it Midsommar.
I always say Midsommar. It's just what it reads to me when I see it.
Yeah.
And I think just the fact that we're talking about how to pronounce it shows how passionate people are about the film.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. I'm just being dumb. But I really, really loved this film too. And I remember my experience watching it was so memorable. It's this film that deals with grief and empathy. And I hear a lot of people talking about how the whole theme of the film is that how people deal with grief. But what really struck me was just seeing Florence Pugh's character in the beginning contrasted with the end of the film, where in the beginning she's crying and it seems like everyone's just trying to shy away from her. She's making them uncomfortable with her tears, and at the end we see her tears even being mimicked and being mirrored by the people out at the compound or whatever it's called.
The people who lacked compassion for her in the first place.
No, they got there.
Oh yeah.
But just seeing them, like her emotions being mirrored and that level of empathy did something for me that was what I was most impressed by with this film. Is it's such a beautiful film, and yet all these terrible things are happening, and it seems like my brain couldn't really even really acknowledge the gravity of all the terrible things that were happening.
Because it was so beautiful.
Yeah, and by the end of it, whatever happens at the end, it was weird that I was initially happy that happened, and I was like, oh wait, no, that was really messed up. That's not okay what happened. So that was Midsommar, and that's why I loved Midsommar.
I love Ari Aster. I love the way that he plays with your emotions and makes you feel things that you don't want to feel, and then makes you feel bad for feeling them.
Yeah.
Ari Aster is someone I really want on my therapy couch.
Oh man, I can only imagine what it would be like to get inside that man's brain. Because have you seen The Strange Thing About the Johnsons.
That's a film where if I'm hanging out with people and like you haven't seen it, we got to watch this together.
Okay, between that, Hereditary, and Midsommar, I'd say he has a lot of issues to work through mentally. But God love him for it because it creates such amazing art. So it's what makes him who he is. One of the best filmmakers, not best horror filmmakers, best filmmakers working today, period.
And that's why I would love to have him in my therapy room. I know he has so much family trauma, but I'd be afraid of like helping him and then he doesn't make this great art anymore. So I just want to know what's going on.
David Lynch once tried to go to therapy and he asked the therapist if they worked through his issues, would it affect his art and change? And she said possibly yes. So he stopped going to therapy for that reason.
That's self-sacrifice if I've ever heard it.
Yep.
My next one is Suspiria 2018. Luca Guadagnino's masterpiece. I really loved it. I've seen it exactly twice. I saw it the first time all the way through, and the second time I saw it chapter by chapter, one a day. And it was really interesting how that second viewing just helped me like clue into like a lot of details that I had missed. First of all, Tilda Swinton absolutely steals the show. Mm-hmm. She's amazing in that.
I had no idea she was so many characters when I first watched it. I didn't recognize her at all.
Same. And seeing her as the therapist was amazing because I had no idea that was her either until after I had seen it.
Yeah.
One of the very, very best horror remakes. As good as horror remakes get.
I agree. Definitely. And again, being a therapist, watching it, I was trying to figure out maybe like what the symbolism or whatever was of the therapist. And then the second time I watched it, I realized something pretty cool. So there's a mention of a psychologist named Jacques Lacan. And Jacques Lacan talks about imago, and imago is kind of like a reflection of your sense of self and your ideal self. And then I started realizing the scenes with mirrors and how it perverts that idea. So like that scene when the girl's dancing and then her body contorts in all those terrible ways.
Oh,
and you
man.
see a reflection of the body. I see that as like a bastardization of the idea of the ideal self, and that kind of just flipped the movie on its head for me. And then even like the big reveal at the end and what people look like there, I just thought that added so much to the film for me.
Cool. Yeah. That's one of the best horror scenes of the decade. One of the standouts.
Yeah, it is.
That was the one that you heard before it was released that people were walking out of at festivals or people were throwing up. And
I don't know if it's all that bad, but then again, we're not normal, so
True.
I think our reactions are a little bit different. We're jaded.
We're a little jaded.
How cool that is, and other people would run away.
I think I'd even challenge it to say, like, we see it, like, oh, that's such a beautiful scene when it's, like, this horrible, terrible looking thing.
What does that say about us?
We'll get into that next time I'm here.
Okay.
Right, I'll go through my next few more quickly, and I'm getting a little into them. So, Happy Death Day, 2017, Christopher Landon. This was one that just really surprised me. I had zero expectations. I had Movie Pass at the time. So, like, this movie's playing, let me go see it.
I loved Movie Pass.
I loved it, too. I
saw everything. Like everything, because I didn't care.
Same. I wouldn't have seen this if I didn't have it. Mm-hmm. And I had a blast. And I had so much fun again. So I just wanted to mention it, too. It was a pleasant surprise for me.
R.I.P. Movie Pass.
I know. I miss it dearly.
Yes.
It worked for Alamo Drafthouse, too. But we didn't have one at the time. That would have been amazing.
They just started a subscription service themselves, Alamo Drafthouse. I don't know how much it costs.
I still haven't gone to the new one in L.A. I've never been to an Alamo Drafthouse, so... It's cool. Definitely on my to-do list.
Yeah, we have to go for my number one film when I talk about it later.
I'm used to ArcLight.
My next few are It Chapter 1, 2017. Again, for being a blockbuster film, I was so impressed with it. It had a lot of good symbolism. The hair and the blood kind of like intertwined and kind of what that says about puberty and the coming of age of these characters. I thought it was expertly done.
It's a big thing with Stephen King if you think about Carrie also. Has a similar...
I really want them to release the director's cut so we can see the original cut that we saw again. Because as good as it was, the original cut was even better.
In the test screenings.
It was the best horror film of that year, but the one that I seen in theater wasn't.
It wasn't the same.
I still disagree that it's the best horror film of the year, but I'll get to that. What I think the best horror film of that year is later.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, but it was excellent. It would have been it's one of the best.
It was great. That was one that after I saw it, I came out really excited to like talk about it. I went to like the midnight screening, so I had to like wait till the next day to text my friends about it. It was just great. I loved it. Next one, Babadook, of course, 2014, Jennifer Kent. amazing. You've all talked about it already.
Yeah.
Same with Black Swan, 2010, Aronofsky. That was a masterpiece. That was right at the beginning of the decade, too, and I just remember it just moved me.
And that was before the elevated horror scene kind of kicked in. Mm-hmm. Which is surprising because it feels like it would fit in more with the crop of horror movies that's come out since like 2014, 2015.
And you've seen Aronofsky play around with horror his whole career. Like Requiem for a Dream is almost a horror movie.
That's scarier than a lot of horror movies, actually.
And then my last honorable mention is a film from 2017, Terrified, by Demian Rugna.
Oh, that was so scary.
Yeah, this is an Argentinian film. Let me read the synopsis real quick. It says, Police Commissioner Funes and 3 researchers of supernatural phenomena investigate inexplicable events that are occurring in the suburbs of Buenos Aires. So this movie was one that genuinely scared me.
Okay, I haven't seen this one.
Oh, man.
I need to catch up on this.
Okay, because I was going to say this is my favorite scare of the decade, but now I don't want to say what it is.
Okay.
But that scene in the kitchen shook me. And that was an image that stayed with me and made it hard to sleep that night.
The Twisted Lady got me. That was even more scary for me.
It's just great
You've
images.
seen the Twisted Lady in the distance, and you think it's just something in the background. It doesn't call attention to itself, and it gets closer and closer, and then you see, holy shit, what is that?
I think that's the best jump scare of the decade for me. Yeah. Definitely.
Real quick, you said The Haunting of Hill House earlier.
Yeah.
That scene in the car with the sisters talking.
Oh my god.
It's a very dramatic moment. Uh-huh. That's my other favorite jump scare of the decade. I don't know what scene you know what I'm talking about.
I know
They're
exactly.
like in a deep conversation, and you get so sucked into the drama of it, you forget you're watching a horror show, and then out of nowhere, bam!
I honestly think it scared me so bad I blocked it from my mind.
It did? Okay, that shit made... I was like, fuck, I forgot this was horror.
Oh, man. Okay, so those are my honorable mentions.
All right, so we're going to start off with our top 10s. Let's have you kick it off, Michael.
Horror show exclusive.
And what better way to start off my top 10 than going back to one of our favorite directors on this show, Ari Aster. My number 10 is Hereditary from 2018. I'm going to go really fast through this so we'll have more time to discuss movies we haven't discussed to death, like we have this one.
I'm sorry to the audience if we sound repetitive.
This one is about a horrible tragedy strikes an already broken family and opens the door to a sinister force that tears them apart from the inside. It's one of the top performances in horror history from Toni Collette.
Easily.
Almost as great performance from Alex Wolff, great performance from Millie Shapiro, an understated performance from Gabriel Byrne. It's one of the most emotional and heart-wrenching horror films I've ever seen. It's strange and dramatic. The acting is stellar. It's original. It has a unique atmosphere and dread. Excellent writing and directing. It's an instant classic, and it's divisive for all the right reasons. And it introduced a truly unique and powerful voice to the genre. And Ari Aster, absolutely loved it.
I like it because it's a movie that hurts you.
Absolutely.
Because it punishes the audience, and I don't mean that as a negative, in the best way possible, by pummeling you with the worst possible realities you could think of. The situation, the scenario seems so realistic. The drama feels real. I can actually relate to some of it, which is kind of scary. And when the supernatural elements hit, they feel that much more awful because the situation was terrible to begin with.
Yeah, and it's a perfect illustration how stress and tragedy can let evil in.
My number 10 is The Loved Ones. Now, I always thought this film was from 2009, but it only played on the festival circuit in 2009 and wasn't released to theaters until 2012. This is directed by Sean Byrne. This is probably my favorite torture film. I'm not really big on the torture porn subgenre of horror. It's never been my thing. In fact, I don't even think this fits into that category necessarily, because the focus of it is more about story and building atmosphere and plot. One of the best things about it is Robin McLeavy as the main character, Lola Stone. She's one of the best horror movie villains of the 2010s. She's almost endearing and heartbreaking for a while, and she reminds me of somebody I knew in high school, and I don't want to name names because I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but she's really endearing, and I felt bad for her. Once you see her more psychotic side come out, it kind of disturbs you because she seemed like such a sympathetic character before. The relationship she has with her father is gross, and it's just as disturbing as any torture scene in the movie. And the scene when they are trying to drill a hole in the young man's head gets me every single time. Under the instructions of director Sean Byrne, Robin McLeavy prepared for the role of Lola by researching the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, watching Misery, Natural Born Killers, and the works of Quentin Tarantino. So that was her preparation for this movie. Sean Byrne went on to direct Devil's Candy, which is another horror film I loved, but it doesn't top this one. This is my favorite torture film of the decade.
My number 10 is The Lighthouse by Robert Eggers. So I know this has been discussed ad nauseum here, but I
want to hear what you have to say.
I do have some things to say. So when this film came out and everyone watched it, I know there was a lot of talk on what it means. And the obvious thing was the myths of Proteus and Prometheus, right? Where Proteus is the keeper of knowledge and Prometheus stole the fire of the gods and was punished by having an eagle eat his innards out, right? Yeah. And when I watched it, I kind of experienced it a little differently, but that's what I like about this film. I think Robert Eggers took a bunch of myths and kind of just like smashed them together. And I don't know how we do with spoilers on here.
Just go ahead and talk about it.
Okay, so I kind of saw it as though Pattinson's character was in purgatory. I think when he tells that story about drowning, I think he died. And I think Defoe's character is kind of like the keeper in purgatory, and he's the one who's testing him to see where he ends up. So that, like, in thinking of it that way, a lot of it made sense to me, where Defoe's character is the one who's keeping the light, and Pattinson's character is not allowed to go up there. And then when Pattinson reveals what he's done is when Defoe's character kind of goes mad and starts yelling, "Why'd you spill your beans? Why'd you spill your beans?" And that's when he could actually, when he goes up there, sees the light, falls down, and dies eventually.
So the final scene makes more sense in that context.
It's kind of like a Rorschach test, the way that it's filmed. It reminds me a lot of The Shining because people have various different interpretations of The Shining. Because like The Shining, it blurs reality and fantasy and what's in somebody's head to the point where you can't tell any apart. So each time you watch it, you could get something different out of it or watch it in a different way.
Absolutely. And we might be able to project kind of like our own insecurities or fears onto what was on the screen. And that's what I really liked about this film too. It wasn't a straight allegory for me. There was some realism to it, but it was fantastical enough for me to buy into that. And then I was even like reading up a little bit about like what purgatory is like, and there's like the 7 layers of purgatory, which is a lot similar to like the 7 deadly sins. And if I think about it too, like Pattinson's character goes through a lot of them, like lust when he like masturbates to the mermaid figurine and then the mermaid appears to him. Or like
Isn't that one of the best masturbation scenes you've ever seen?
Again, one of the other best ones is from American Horror Story with Dylan McDermott in the mirror.
Oh yeah.
And then like the whole lobster talk, gluttony, hilarious. And then even there's a point in the film where Defoe's character says that seagulls carry the lost souls of sailors.
Yes.
And it's killing the seagull, which is what might spark everything in the film. So for me, putting that all together and contextualizing it with him being in purgatory is what really made me excited about this film and kind of obsess over it a little bit. And just read as much as I can to try to make sense of it. And I love a film that makes me do that.
I've seen it 5 times now.
5 times.
I've seen it 5 times. I've showed it to several people. That's why I was like, you need to watch this. You need to watch this. You need to watch this.
I honestly thought it would be less impactful when I brought it home and watched it on my TV. It didn't lose anything.
Oh, wow. I've only seen it the one time, and I thought the aspect ratio was amazing, and that's what I was afraid of too, is watching it on the smaller screen might take away from it, because the cinematography was gorgeous too.
I've been hearing a backlash. People have been whining and bitching about the aspect ratio, saying it doesn't show enough. I saw somebody online say it was an insult to cinematographers. I was like,
oh gosh,
what?
That's what I really love about Robert Eggers, though, is he's so meticulous about his filmmaking. So even the aspect ratio is what makes it more realistic to the time. And
it evokes a different era.
Absolutely. And didn't he use like camera lenses from like the 1800s?
From the 20s and the newest camera lens he used was from the 1930s.
Wow.
So that's why all the scenes where they're inside the house, like when they're having dinner by the lamp, they had to light it so bright and glaring that they couldn't even see each other when they were delivering their dialogue back and forth at the dinner table. You can't tell. I mean, it looks like they're looking right at each other, but because the camera is so different that they had to put the light at almost a blinding level for good long sections of the movie, they couldn't see anything around them.
And I think that's what makes the cinematography so impressive. Is when people think of cinematography, they think of camera angles, they think of camera work. But
lighting is really important too.
Lighting is one of the biggest parts of it.
It's like expressionism.
Absolutely. And again, like talking about how meticulous Eggers is, and I heard him talking about the language that they use and how he researched it by going into like old literature from the era and the region, and even consulting with this woman, I forgot her name, but consulting with her just to make sure everything was consistent with the time and the era and how sailors would have spoken at that time. Yeah. So I just really appreciate his level of filmmaking.
Yeah, he did the same thing with The Witch.
Mm-hmm.
I'll talk about that later.
So will I.
So that was my number 10, The Lighthouse.
Good choice.
All right, that brings us to my number 9, and it just so happens that James's number 10 was a Sean Byrne film. My number 9 is also a Sean Byrne film, The Devil's Candy from 2000.
Wait, you like The Devil's Candy more than The Loved Ones?
I think The Loved Ones was actually a better film.
Okay.
But The Devil's Candy was just more my thing.
Okay.
It had more things that I love about horror, and I think the level of tension that this film achieves, put it over the top for me, and made it into my top 10 instead of The Loved Ones. It's about an artist and his family, and an artist and a family man who loves metal music, played by Ethan Embry, and he moves his wife and daughter to a new home in rural Texas. He sets up his studio in the barn, and evil forces begin to invade his life as he works on his new painting. Meanwhile, he must also deal with the deranged son of the previous owners, played by Pruitt Taylor Vince. This was excellent performances from Ethan Embry, Sherry Appleby, Kiara Glasgow, who played the daughter, and Pruitt Taylor Vince, who played the villain. The villain that you could see. There's also an unseen villain that's awesome in this one. It's atmospheric and dramatic, but it's also fun and just dripping with evil and suspense. And like I said before, the tension reaches a fever pitch several times throughout the film. And it's also very visual with a great metal soundtrack. And it's perfect pacing for me that helps the film get inside your head while exciting you and scaring the hell out of you at the same time. It's just so many things I loved about this movie. I loved every act, and then the climax did not disappoint. And I loved Ethan Embry's performance. I loved seeing him. He was all buff and long-haired and metal dude. I've never seen him.
Checking him out.
I've never seen him like that before. So that was it was a refreshing film to me all the way around. And just the tension is the main thing that made me put it as number 9 on my top 10 list.
It's one of the best metal-related horror movies, too.
Yes.
And what's interesting, a lot of people portray metalheads in films as being, like, unruly or violent or loud. I have a lot of friends that are on the metal scene, and they're all into horror, and they all get stereotyped at being that way. Yeah. The metalheads in this family are lovable, they're sweet, they're kind people. They're like the metalheads that I actually know. So it gives good respect to that community. It's a more realistic portrayal of people like that.
Yeah, and I like the father-daughter relationship, and I love how he bonds with her over metal and art and everything.
It's pretty cute.
Yeah.
I love what you said, James, because it's so true where metalheads and horror fans in general get this reputation when they're like the most soft-spoken, nicest people I know most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time. And I was glad that this movie actually was honest about that.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't hurt that it's made from somebody who's an insider. And you actually see that Sean Byrne is a metalhead in The Loved Ones because there's a couple of metal songs that are playing on the radio.
Oh, yeah.
So it's pretty obvious from the beginning that he was always very much into that.
So this movie was very metal without being cliche metal.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. My number 9 movie is a movie that's very divisive and one I was not a fan of when I first saw it. It is The Lords of Salem from 2012, directed by Rob Zombie. This is a synopsis. Heidi, a radio DJ, is sent a box containing a record, a gift from the Lords. The sounds within the grooves trigger flashbacks of her town's violent past. Is Heidi going mad or the Lords back to take revenge on Salem, Massachusetts? I'm a little bit biased. I think witch horror movies, anything related to witches, are usually my favorite types of horror movies, are the ones that scare me for the most for some reason. I don't know what it is about those archetypes that get under my skin more than anything else. I also think this is Rob Zombie's most artistic movie. Not his best movie, but his most artistically directed. It reminds me a little bit of a Lost Dario Argento movie that has a layer of grime. I think that Cherry Moon Zombie is really good in this movie. I think she's always unfairly shit on as an actress, and I think she portrays a very realistic person in this movie. I've met women like her before who's like older mom type of characters who are still kind of hip, but still hanging on to it a little bit. Seems like a real person to me. One of the most interesting things about Rob Zombie's, one of his gimmicks, or his tricks, if you will, is in all of his movies, he likes to play home videos of the main characters in happier times after juxtaposing it with shocking or violent images. And most of the time when he employs this trick, it's done for comedic effect. In this film, he does the same thing, but it feels really sad and tragic. So it's a good play. It's a good flip on what he usually does. I love the way that it's shot, and that it's a very off-kilter style. Despite all of the strange and surreal imagery, there are no digital effects in this movie, which could have tricked me because a lot of it seemed like it would have to be achieved digitally. It was shot in only 22 and a half days. I actually think that if this movie had come out 5 or 6 years later, it would have been much better received than it was in its time. I think it was going for more of what elevated horror tries to get at. It reminds me a little bit of Rosemary's Baby or something like that. And I think that it just missed its time. And I think, and it's unfortunate because I feel like Rob Zombie has been discouraged from ever making these types of movies again because it had such a bad reaction. But I think people need to check out The Lords of Salem one more time.
I enjoyed most of it. It's the end that lost me. But I really enjoyed it through most of it.
See, I actually hated the ending of it at first, and it felt flat. It felt really flat to me the first time I'd seen it. When I watched it again recently, it affected me very deeply and in a much different way. I was able to appreciate it on a different level.
Okay, I need to give that one a rewatch.
I think I was looking for something different out of it when I first saw it, which kind of would explain my initial disappointment. But I didn't realize watching it again how well made it actually is, and how it was Rob Zombie. He's usually associated with one type of horror film, and he was trying to stretch out his artistic palette in different directions by trying to make this type of horror film. And I feel that the reception scared him away from ever trying anything like this again. And I would say, Rob Zombie, do something like this again.
Yeah. No,
don't listen to don't listen to all the trash talking and haters, because horror fans are a fucking fickle group of people. And they shit on a lot of movies that are, horror fans love to complain about all the sequels and remakes out there, but all they ever go to see is sequels and remakes, and then they get pissed off when they see an original film and shit all over it. So, don't listen to them.
Yeah, I have a theory that Rob Zombie listens way too much to the haters, and he also listens way too much to the people who love him. He should just do what he feels.
I agree.
And don't make anything else like 31.
Well, I always like to say no one hates horror like horror fans.
Yeah.
So
That's true.
There's a lot of criticism, especially like you said with Cherry Moon Zombie. I think this is one of her stronger performances.
Yeah.
And I don't think she's terrible, and she gets so much flack for I don't know why.
She seems like a real person to me.
Yeah.
I feel like I know people just like her in this movie. So when people say, this is awful, it's unrealistic, I'm like, what do you mean it's unrealistic?
Same.
I know fucking people like that. What are you talking about?
Definitely agreed. Okay, so now my number 9 is Creep from 2014.
Ooh.
And this could have just as easily been Creep 2. But I just went for Creep. I thought it was hilarious. It was genuinely scary. And I really liked the way that it built tension throughout the film. Mm-hmm. And for it being a found footage film, because that's the thing that people ask nowadays, is like, how is a found footage film realistic? Everyone has cell phones now. No one really uses cameras. And I thought the way, like the setup was really realistic and really convincing, and was a really good take on like a modern found footage film.
On more than 90% of the movie, it feels justified that the camera would be on at that moment. Where most found footage movies, in my experience, even the ones I really enjoy, it doesn't make sense that the camera would be turned on this much at that moment. So Creep does make it feel very natural.
And that big moment at the end, were you the same as me, where you didn't think it was actually going to happen up until it actually did?
I did not think it was going to happen until it actually did. And even though everything was pointing towards that, it still caught me off guard.
Yeah, it's so crazy. It shows great directing and great writing.
Also, Peach Fuzz.
Yeah.
Peach Fuzz. That mask is great. So uncomfortable, too. The movie's awkward and funny. And then the longer it goes on, everything that was funny but awkward starts to seem really creepy and uneasy. And by the longer it goes on, your heart starts racing. Really builds up suspense very steadily the entire runtime.
What was it, Tubby Time?
Tubby time.
geez.
Oh my god.
That was exactly my experience. I thought Peach Fuzz was hilarious, and as like the comedy of it like went down, the tension, the fear went up, like in a really slow way that just really got to me. It was really unsettling.
Yeah. And I love how Tubby Time got a whole new dynamic in part 2.
Mark Duplass is incredible as
Yeah, he is.
the creep. So fucking funny though.
Yeah, the Duplass brothers make some excellent movies.
And just one last thing, like I said, Creep 2 could have just as easily been on here, but I chose Creep 1. And what surprised me most is that they took a similar premise, but it still felt completely novel and completely new, and it still completely worked. And I thought that was great.
I like Creep 2 almost as much as I like the original Creep. In some ways it's better. They're both on my list. But as a horror movie, purely as a horror film, I think the first one works a little bit better in that regard.
One is just scarier because you don't know what he is. And then by the part 2, you know what he is.
Mm-hmm.
It might have made it less scary, but it did not take away from the film.
No, because it has such a completely different dynamic than the first film that there's something new to latch onto.
Cool.
So
that brings us to my number 8. I have quite a bit more to say about this one because we haven't talked about this one quite as much on the show. It's American Mary from 2012. I thought it was a masterpiece. It's written and directed by Jen and Sylvia Soska, another pair of directors who shit the bed with a remake, just like the other guys did with Pet Sematary. They did that with the Rabid remake. I don't know what happened because it seems like totally different directors did American Mary. It's about a med student, Mary, played by Katharine Isabelle, who is strapped financially and takes a gig that she thinks is easy money, but ends up immersing her in the world of body modification and underground surgeries. Excellent performance by Katharine Isabelle from Ginger Snaps, and this film and Ginger Snaps made her horror royalty for me, so I'll watch anything she's in. It also a great performance by Tristan Risk, who plays Beatrice Johnson, who's like a Betty Boop character, where she modifies her face and her body to look like Betty Boop. It's a truly one-of-a-kind film with a layered and impressive performance by Katharine Isabelle, and one of the 2 films that rock the horror genre. And the body modification gives you a strange and unnerving feeling even before the gore comes in. Just seeing what these people do to themselves for aesthetic purposes. And the blood and guts increase with the tension of the film, and you root for Mary even when you see her doing unspeakable things. And no matter how much blood and guts are in it and how much depravity she's immersed in, you still root for her. It's clever and interesting dialogue mixed with intense body horror. The effects are amazing. The Girl Wants to Be a Doll is fascinating and disturbing, and so is the Beatrice Johnson character that I mentioned, where she modified herself to look like Betty Boop. It's a confident film. It's in your face. The execution of the original idea is almost flawless for me, and the story keeps you engrossed through the entire film. And this is everything that Rabid was not. And I absolutely love American Mary. It's an instant classic for me.
They're already scary the first time you see a lot of these people because they all look like dolls. All the people who get modified do not look like human beings, and it's so unnatural that if I ever saw people like that approaching me on the street in real life, I'd probably get very far away.
Yeah.
So even without the more graphic elements, the characters are just fucking creepy for the way they look.
Yeah. Do you believe the theory that Michael Jackson tried to make himself look like Diana Ross through surgery?
No, just because I try not to support sensationalistic things like that, but who knows?
What I'm getting from you, Michael, is that if you're a director and you directed your sibling, just don't try to remake anything.
Yeah. Exactly.
Did you see American Mary?
I have not seen American Mary. I know. It was a tough decade for me. I was telling Michael before we started recording it. This decade I was like in grad school, and I missed a lot. And now it's like going through my list. It's a lot of catch up. So that's like top 5 in my list of what I'm going to go through when we're done.
Oh, trust me, there's a lot of things that we missed out on too. It's kind of hard to catch everything.
You've seen Ginger Snaps, right?
Yeah, of course.
So you'll like this one. You like Catherine Isabel.
All right, my number 8 film of the decade is Gerald's Game from director Mike Flanagan. I still think The Haunting of Hill House is the best thing he's ever done as a whole, but for just his feature-length films, this is the best one for me. This is the synopsis. A couple tries to spice up their marriage in a remote lake house. After the husband dies unexpectedly, the wife is left handcuffed to their bed frame and must fight to survive and break free. This is one that I really love because I was a really big fan of the book Gerald's Game, but it's written in such a way that I could never imagine it ever being adapted to a film. There's nothing about it that's cinematic, and it's extremely literary. So when I first heard that they were going to make this into a movie, I was very skeptical about what it was going to turn out like, and I was so blown away by what Mike Flanagan did with it because it's extremely faithful to the novel. It doesn't really break at all from from Stephen King's vision, but it manages to translate it into a different type of language, cinematic language, and to make it work. It's devastatingly simple and very effective. It all hinges on Carla Gugino's performance because for most of the film, she is stuck handcuffed to the bed with nothing but her mind to feed on itself, and she really sells her role. The trauma that she's enduring while she's handcuffed to the bed, and how it forces her to relive traumatic experiences from the past. By the end, I think it's almost an inspiring story of strength and survival about fortitude and the human spirit. So I know that might sound kind of corny, but I really like the ending of it. It goes to some pretty uncomfortable places dealing with child molestation and heavy topics like that, but it never feels heavy-handed, it never feels like exploitation, and it never overtakes the movie at any point. It has one of my favorite makeup effects is when she's trying to get loose from the bed that she's handcuffed from. I cringe to think about it, and I the hairs stand up on my neck when she's basically almost peeling her hand off, the skin off her hand.
Skin glove.
It looks like a skin glove, and the way she pulls really, really, really shocked me. Overall, it's a fantastic Stephen King adaptation. Another interesting thing about the movie, there's virtually no soundtrack during the whole course of the movie. So that kind of makes it a little bit more believable and realistic that you're inside this woman's head, because in real life, if you were going mad, there wouldn't be all the cinematic music coming in. You wouldn't feel anything like that. And the headboard, just another interesting fact, the headboard of the bed is the lower half of the laser glass from Oculus.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
So it's my favorite Mike Flanagan film, my favorite film of his. I think it's a masterpiece, one of the best Stephen King adaptations, relentlessly intense, extremely effective. I love it.
I never read the source material, but everything I've heard is that it's unbelievable how true to the source material it was.
It is. It's very, very true to the source material.
Yeah, and just like you said, most people thought it could never be done.
I was so skeptical of it.
Yeah, just it being in one room, and that just speaks volumes to Mike Flanagan's talent.
He's for me the most consistent horror filmmaker working today. Like every one of his movies is top notch. Everything that he directs is top notch. I don't think he has a single bum film in his filmography yet.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah, and I really love this film too because, like you're mentioning, it kind of tackles that existential aloneness of how people don't like to be alone for that reason of they have to face their thoughts, they have to face the things that they try to avoid throughout the day.
And what's interesting is the situation that she's in, being tied up to the bed so her and her husband could spice up their marriage. They're playing sex games. It makes her vulnerable in a way that triggers memories about her being vulnerable as a child that she's completely repressed. So only this type of situation would have been able to have brought that out. Almost like years of therapy might bring it out if you if she were to go through that.
When we experience trauma, we hold a lot of it in our body. So you're spot on with that. Her being completely open and vulnerable and chained to the bed might have brought up a lot of times where maybe she's felt like that in the past, and brings back all these memories and having to face all these memories that her brain was probably protecting her from all these years. And I thought that was so done in such a cool way.
Mm-hmm. And it could have been done really cheap given what the subject matter is and what she's reminiscing on, but it doesn't feel cheap.
And then he did that other excellent film, Hush, which is another one just primarily 1 to 2 characters in one location. And nailed that one too.
That's Mike Flanagan, man.
So now my number 8 is Get Out, 2017. Directed by Jordan Peele. Chris and his girlfriend Rose go upstate to visit her parents for the weekend. At first, Chris reads the family's overly accommodating behavior as nervous attempts to deal with their daughter's interracial relationship. But as the weekend progresses, a series of increasingly disturbing discoveries lead him to a truth that he never could have imagined. And this film, I think, was another one that changed the game. It really changed the horror genre and kind of the direction we're going in. And I love Jordan Peele for this. And one of my favorite quotes that I've seen online about this film, it says, "I love that if the movie Get Out existed in the world of Get Out, the parents would have told Chris how much they loved Get Out."
Exactly.
So I think it's hilarious, it's terrifying, and it is a brilliantly done satire of kind of just like the racial disparities that we're living through today.
Yeah.
It also critiques a certain type of racist where I feel like a lot of movies that deal with racist or racism deal with the more overt racist, alt-right types, you might say. This to me is about liberal racists, people who are condescending in the way that they try to be so well-meaning that they go over the top and overstating everything. And people who overstate things that much have to hold some kind of prejudice if they're going out of their way to show off how not racist they actually are. Liberal upper-class racism that tries to pass itself off as being more compassionate.
Yeah.
That's what I got. At least that's what I get out of it.
Yeah, I remember when I first saw this, I referred to it as the tone-deaf ally.
Tone-deaf?
Yeah, he tries so hard to be an ally of this disparaged community when it just your attempts are so tone-deaf and they're not helpful.
Yeah.
Like when the father tells him, you know, I would have voted for Barack Obama for a third term. Total cringe, but I've heard people say stupid shit like that in real life, so it's pretty realistic.
And that's after Rose tells Chris, you know, my dad always says he would have voted for Obama for a third term. So that just shows like how scripted this all is. And like, these are the things I say to be inclusive.
That's what she said. She's like, my dad's not racist. He would have voted for Obama for a third term. So that automatically excuses you from any possible prejudice that you might hold.
Shut your mouth or I'll rip your lips off.
And it was so dumb that the movie had one character that was a comic relief and then it was categorized as a comedy at the Golden Globes.
I think it's because it's I don't know. If it's a comedy, it's a black comedy. And I think the comedy is second to the horror. So I could I thought it was dumb at the time, but watching again over time and watching it with people, everybody always laughs their ass off when they're watching it. Even when they're in the middle of a suspense scene, people will get giggles out of it. So I guess I could see it being categorized as a comedy.
And also,
it's definitely satirical.
Yeah, that it is. And the Golden Globes kind of have that weird category anyway, where like if it's not quite a drama, they put in the category of comedy. It's like The Martian won like a couple years ago.
Yeah.
The Martian.
Yeah, right. But the what I loved about this film too is what we're saying, how it's like the well-intentioned liberal who's like maybe subtly racist and doesn't know it. It's just it comes out in such a strong way where they have such like reverence for black people in the African American community so much that they want to be them, and they don't realize they're enslaving them by doing that at the same time.
Yeah.
I feel a lot of people do that unintentionally, where black culture is fetishized to the point where it's kind of creepy.
Yeah, white people co-opting black culture.
And trying to. I mean, there's nothing wrong with appreciating different cultures and everything, but there's obviously a point when you're trying too hard. And it becomes very apparent for anybody who is a person of color will notice it right off the bat.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Michael. I'm just kidding.
I'm white, all right. Big deal. I can't help it.
Hi, I'm Elliot. You're listening to Ghostman Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
All right, that brings us to my number 7. This one was one of my favorite horror films from 2010. It was Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, directed and co-written by Eli Craig. I got the great privilege I was working for a horror website at the time. I got the great privilege to go to the Beverly Hills Hotel and interview the director and the 2 stars of it. And it was an excellent experience, just like the movie. And Alan Tudyk plays Tucker. Tyler Labine plays Dale. Katrina Bowden from 30 Rock plays Tucker's love interest. Dale's love interest. And Jesse Moss from Ginger Snaps plays the main villain. But it's a movie about the lovable hillbillies, Tucker and Dale. They go on vacation at their rundown mountain cabin and end up being mistaken for backwoods killers by a group of preppy college students. It's a full-on horror bromance that is laugh-out-loud riot funny, with fun and gory kills and an almost sickeningly sweet spirit. And one of the defining horror comedies of this generation, as far as I'm concerned, a 100% original idea executed with passion, heart, and it's both an homage to slashers and a skewering of classic slasher tropes. The high concept is elevated even higher by the perfect casting in the 2 leads. It's complete with a love interest for doe-eyed redneck Dale, a college student turned diabolical villain, and Jesse Moss, he was excellent in that role. And it devolves into a slapstick, sappy romance and a cheesy final fight, but it all works thanks to the writing and the acting performances. I thought this was a pitch-perfect horror comedy. It's everything that I think horror comedy should be. It's a 100% original idea when you think everything's been done, and that's why I love Tucker and Dale vs. Evil as my number 7.
Definitely one of the most fun. It didn't make any of my lists, but it's definitely one of the most purely fun horror movies to come out this decade. There's definitely horror movies that are scarier, more in your face, more violent, but few that have this kind of joyful, playful spirit that it has.
Yeah, and extremely gory.
Yeah.
And you're usually laughing your ass off when the horror comes, so it gives you a weird feeling to see that much blood and guts and laughing your ass off that hard.
And I think how much is downplayed is what makes it so funny too.
Yes.
I was just looking up a quote from Tucker where he says, "There we were, minding our own business, just doing chores around the house when kids started killing themselves all over my property."
And they delivered those lines perfectly.
Oh, it's great.
The best actors you could have chosen for those roles.
Tucker and Dale versus Evil.
Yeah, and I know some lovable rednecks, so it was fairly accurate. It was a little exaggerated, but it was fairly accurate.
My number 7 movie is Bone Tomahawk from 2015, directed by S. Craig Zoller.
I love it so much.
In the dying days of the Old West, an elderly sheriff and his posse set out to rescue their town's doctor from cannibalistic cave dwellers. This is one of the best genre hybrids I've ever seen. It works perfectly as a Western and perfectly as a horror movie. It works as a horror movie because the horror flows organically out of the Western setting, and the Western setting is a perfect way to convey desolate isolation and hopelessness. And the idea of the Wild West, the idea of the lawlessness of the era, all the isolation and how it's so cut off from the rest of society, it seems like you would see more Western movies that incorporate horror, because when the cannibals come into play in the movie, it doesn't feel like it came out of left field, or it doesn't feel like it came out of nowhere. It feels like, yeah, this is a very dangerous world, and there would be a cannibalistic tribe out there somewhere. It's probably one of my favorite cannibal movies. I love Kurt Russell in this movie, Patrick Wilson, David Arquette, Sid Haig, one of the best cast of any horror movie of the 2010s. It was shot only in 21 days and made with a budget of $1.8 million, and it kicked off the career of S. Craig Zoller, one of my favorite filmmakers currently working. Totally brutal. It takes a lot of people I know think it's a boring movie because it takes a long time before you get to actually the horror of the situation and any gore. So most of the time you are spent just getting to know the characters. You go on them with the journey. You get to know them as people, appreciate their struggles and what they're going through. And when they're thrown into the situation with the cannibals, that makes it that much more horrifying. So fucking brutal. And there's one scene where I'm not even going to describe it, but
That scene.
Yeah, that scene. Basically almost turning somebody inside out while they're alive. Holy fuck, that shit got under my skin. Fantastic gore. Completely realistic. Really shocking. Brutal. And a lot of the times when you see cannibal movies that have that type of gore, it seems slightly campy or slightly exaggerated. This feels like you're actually watching people being ripped apart in front of your eyes.
And I didn't
really
expect
jarring.
it to go that far. So after all that character development and this slow burn, I did not expect it to go there.
And I think that's what makes it so effective, because it kind of, you know that something awful's coming, but you don't know how awful it is. But for about over an hour, it lulls you into a sense of, I wouldn't say serenity because it's marching towards something bad, but there's a lot of relaxed moments. It's not a rushed movie, and it's just a lot of it is just casual conversations between the characters, and I think that's what makes it such a rich movie and what makes the horror that much better when it actually comes.
Agreed.
So for me, number 7, one of the best genre hybrids of the decade, Bone Tomahawk.
And spoiler alert, I'll be talking about that one much more.
Here's another interesting thing. This is the second David Arquette Western involving cannibalism. The first one was Ravenous from 1999.
Oh. Good bit of trivia there.
Yeah, especially because cannibalistic Westerns, I don't think, are that big of a genre for him to be in 2 of them.
Probably 2 of the very few that exist.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're on to my number 7. So you two fine gentlemen have been talking about your metal horror, and I'm not a big metal guy, so I have to go with the punk horror film this decade, which is Green Room, 2015.
A24.
Very cool.
I love anything they make, but Green Room was a standout for me. Jeremy Saulnier, a punk rock band, becomes trapped in a secluded venue after finding a scene of violence. For what they saw, the band themselves become targets of violence from a gang of white power skinheads who want to eliminate all evidence of the crime. So this film was, if I could just put it simply, was just badass.
Yes.
It was
Relentless.
It was awesome. It was really realistic in its portrayal of like gigging and touring with your band and just trying to find anywhere to play and then ending up somewhere that just makes you incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I remember I used to play in a punk band in high school and showing up to some venues or showing up to some house gigs and just feeling unsafe and wanting to get the hell out of there. And this really evoked that for me.
Yeah, I was in a metal band for 8 years. And it's very realistic the way they show these band members interact with each other and then the way they handle this situation. And you do get thrown into situations like that. Well, like it wasn't as intense as this one, but we got thrown into a situation where it was a lot of really intense, huge metalheads. And they were like demanding that we rock their asses off and blow their heads up.
Gotta respect any movie that uses Nazi punks fuck off in it.
That's what I was gonna say. In those times where I felt uncomfortable, like our band would leave and like ditch the gig, we wouldn't stand there and play a song that would piss everyone off.
Yeah.
That's when you know things are gonna go bad in this movie. It's like, these people have balls. You're gonna play Nazi punks fuck off right in front of a group of Nazis.
I love that because that's the same way we responded to it. We responded by getting in these fuckers' faces and right there,
So you're just much cooler than I am, is what you're saying.
I'm surprised that we don't see more punk rock horror, because I think after metal, punk rockers are another group that are naturally drawn to horror. I think metalheads, punk rockers, rockabilly are all drawn to horror films. And Anton Yelkin, R.I.P. Very sad.
Yeah, R.I.P. And something else I really loved about this film was the characters and the gore, and it seemed like the gore always had a purpose to it. And the gore actually worked a lot into the character development itself, and these characters are really realistic. When we have a film like this, like a slasher film, sometimes you have like the bumbling idiot who like messes everything up, or the person who has like these like incredible luck or superpowers, and these people just seemed really realistic in what they were capable of and what they ended up doing.
What's interesting to me is it's a horror movie that doesn't always feel like a horror movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
It feels closer to reality. But did you, by any chance, and it was going off, same director, have you seen Blue Ruin?
No, I haven't seen Blue Ruin.
Not a horror movie, but fucking excellent. And if you like Green Room, I think you really need to check that out. You'll like it.
That one even more than Green Room.
Yeah, excellent movie.
Yeah, I've heard really great things about it, but you like it more than Green Room. That's very high praise. So you have to check that out.
Like when I watched Green Room, I loved it. I was like, "It's no Blue Ruin, but it's so good."
Yeah. One last thing that I noticed online too, and I was kind of reading about this, and people were just drawing the parallel how in the movie the bad guys are these white supremacists who have this front that's like an entertainment front, and that just kind of seems a little relevant nowadays.
Oh, yeah. For sure.
Who are you referring to specifically?
Nobody. Exactly. Just
Nobody?
everybody.
Okay.
And so that's my number 7, Green Room.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll skin your cat and it.
All right. What's your number 6, Michael?
My number 6 is another horror comedy, The Cabin in the Woods from 2011, but it's decidedly more inventive than...
I'm really shocked I have this higher than you.
Oh, you do?
I'm kind of really surprised. All right, but go on.
It's directed and co-written by Drew Goddard. I love this guy. It's co-written by Joss Whedon. And I was really excited to see this one because I remember when I was watching Lost, the TV show, there came a certain time, I forgot what season it was, but the writing was just elevated. It was more gripping. There was a noticeable difference in it. And I looked up, it was so much of a difference that I looked up the writers, and it was Drew Goddard. So when Drew Goddard wrote for Lost, I think that was the best of the series. And Kristen Connolly is great as Dana, Chris Hemsworth as Kurt, Franz Kranz as Marty the Stoner, and Richard Jenkins and Bradley Whitford are both excellent as scientists in this one. It's a familiar horror story. 5 friends go to a remote cabin, but it turns totally unfamiliar when they realize that they're being monitored and controlled by scientists in an underground facility who are making them play a twisted and murderous game to appease the gods. It's another instant classic horror comedy that's refreshing with a concept that has never been done before, written superbly by Drew Goddard with input from Joss Whedon. It follows enough horror tropes that it could be a decent horror film without the twist, but the twist and the way the characters handle it is what makes it special for me. And I also thought it was interesting that the makeup was designed by David Leroy Anderson, who is the husband of Heather Langenkamp, Nancy from Nightmare on Elm Street. And she also helped a lot with it, and it's almost all practical effects. So it's unbelievable if you watch it. It's familiar elements mixed with completely original elements. A very interesting play on typical horror characters, the jock, the hot girl, the stoner, the virgin. And the kids are manipulated into fitting these stereotypes, even if it's not who they are. It's phenomenally crafted. I love the sequence where the monsters are let loose, spoiler alert. And it's so impressive, I was sure that a lot of it was CGI, but only 2 of those monsters that were released were CGI. Everything else was practical. And I feel that this is the Scream of the 2010s.
I agree.
Perfectly said.
Self-aware, clever, and a great execution all the way around.
I saw that 3 times in theaters.
Really?
I loved it. Complete blast.
Yeah, that was what I thought too when I saw it. I remember when I first saw Scream and that whole Scream franchise and kind of what it did for me and how it made me so excited for the genre. Yeah. And seeing Cabin in the Woods do a similar thing and like kind of recreate that energy for me was just what put this movie over the top for me.
Yeah.
You know, it's crazy. It should have been released, I think, in 2009. And it was shelved by the studios because they thought it was too weird and they didn't have much confidence in it. It wasn't until Joss Whedon released The Avengers in 2012, and obviously we all know what a big hit that movie became, that the studio decided to release The Cabin in the Woods after that. So it stood in limbo for a good while.
I don't understand why it's such a solid film.
So we could put it on this list.
Yeah.
it was in limbo with Robert Pattinson's character in The Lighthouse.
Yes.
And I love the coffee mug bong.
Oh, something really interesting about that coffee mug bong. I might as well say it now that you've already brought it up. That is actually a fully functioning coffee mug bong, and it cost about $5,000 to make. So it's fully functional. You could use it as a coffee mug and as a bong. So you're watching. That's not a fake prop.
Wow.
Give me one of those when I'm rich.
All right, my number 6 is another movie I've talked to death about on here anyway. Is my favorite horror film from last year, Loose, directed by Tillman Singer. A rainy night, dazed and numb, Luce, a young cab driver, drags herself into the brightly lit entrance of a rundown police station. In a night spot, Nora seductively engages police psychiatrist Dr. Rossini in a conversation. Nora tells the doctor about her old schoolmate Luce's rebellious past at a Chilean school for girls. Nora is possessed by a demonic entity, longing for the woman it loves, Luce. One of my favorite horror films of the decade. It's a movie that I absolutely love because I feel it kind of reinvents the possessions subgenre of horror movies. It's hard to do a possession movie without aping The Exorcist, and this one manages to do that. It's more disorienting than any other possession film that I've ever seen. It's a little bit confusing at times, but I think that helps to put you in the mind frame of what it would be like to be possessed by a demon. It hypnotizes the viewer with its slow and confounding but mesmerizing style into a trance-like state, just like the main character is in. It's deeply surreal, and it manages to do this by taking place in mostly two locations. Two locations are used throughout the movie, and a couple little things for flash in and out. But it's a marvel of low-budget filmmaking because it's a student thesis film. It's creepy. It's very strange, and I think for a lot of horror fans, this is probably going to be a turnoff. For most horror fans, I would say it's just something that happens to fit my specific taste very well. And I'll be honest, I might be overrating this movie a little bit, but this is just my personal perception of it. One of the most original horror movies I've ever seen, and I love that it takes the possession subgenre in a completely different direction. And I just can't get most of the images out of this movie. I can't get them out of my head.
Another impressive horror film done by a student.
Yeah, and it's almost approaches David Lynch levels of surrealism at times. And to do that with such a low budget as a student film kind of blows me away, and maybe that makes me rate it even higher, is the fact that I don't think a movie made with such limited resources should be this good or this artistic. Like, I'm pretty sure it was the envy of the art school that it was in when it was being screened. I can only imagine trying to compete with the filmmaker like that on a low budget and seeing it would make my blood burn.
Yeah. So what's your guess of where this director is going to go from here? When they get a budget, is it going to hurt them or is it going to help them?
I think it might help. It's really interesting because it's such a have you seen it yet?
I haven't.
Oh man, it has such a distinctive style. It doesn't feel like anything else out there right now. And you get a very good sense of the type of filmmaker this director is going to be. The director, Tilman Singer, is a German filmmaker. He considered it only a calling card. It was only designed to get more attention for him to fund bigger projects. But I don't think he realized how good what he had on his hands was. It's not a student film. It is a fully formed film that works fantastically on its own, and it was a big hit on the horror festival circuit. We've always caused a lot of buzz. I think like at the Fantasia Film Fest was the big talk of that. And Mike and I actually reported about this movie a year before it came out just because it was making such big buzz on the festival circuit. And it's a movie that completely exceeded all of my expectations. And another thing that I loved about it, I didn't know how to feel about it the first time I watched it because I was so disoriented and confused. But Mike and I, when we watched it, we came back to his house and we didn't really say anything about the movie because we didn't know what to say. And then as we started recounting the plot of the movie, it started to make sense all of a sudden, as you call.
We understood it?
Yeah, we understood it the whole time, the way you recall a dream. And I think it takes an impressive level of skill for any filmmaker to try to put you in a dream state. So much so that when you recall the film, the meaning of it starts to crystallize the way that a dream might. Kind of intimidating, to be honest, for a filmmaker to do that on their first film. Overall, fucking impressive. Please, it's on Shudder. Check it out, people. It's only 70 minutes long. It might be a turnoff for you, but give it a chance. And even if you don't like it, watch it again after because you might think differently about it once you see it a second time. And watch it with a friend and discuss it when it's done because your appreciation of it will go up a lot.
Yeah, if I hadn't discussed it with you, I wouldn't have known that I understood it.
And what's cool, I love the aesthetic. It really evokes the 1980s horror films with the synth score. I love that it was shot on 16mm Kodak film. And you could see the difference. A lot of movies try to give their films a more vintage look when they're shot digitally by adding effects to it to make it look like film. this is the type of film look that could not be recreated digitally. It feels like something that came from a different era, almost like a forgotten Euro horror flick that nobody had ever seen before. Yeah. Excellent movie. 70 minutes long.
Yeah, I was really excited when you first started talking about it and was kind of frustrated it wasn't available anywhere. And then it popped up on Shudder not too long ago. But I still haven't watched it, and I've just been really intentional of my state of mind when I watch it because of what you said of how it's kind of dreamlike and how it's something that might be confusing at first and maybe discussing it after will help.
I know you don't smoke weed very often. Might not hurt.
Noted. Noted. Well, then maybe... Okay, never mind.
Yeah, so Loose. Loved it. German horror, 2019.
So, for like the rest of my list, most of it's really hard to find these top films, and it came down to what impacted me the most. Like, emotionally, what hit me. So, the first of these films that I can say really stayed with me was my number 6, and that's The Witch from 2015. Robert Eggers. In 1630s New England, William and Catherine lead a devout Christian life with 5 children, homesteading on the edge of an impassable wilderness, exiled from their settlement when William defies a local church. When their newborn son vanishes and crops mysteriously fail, the family turns on one another. So I have to be completely honest about how I first saw this film. And I was with some friends, and we went to some craft beer event, and I fell asleep watching this because it is a slow burn, and that was just unacceptable. So finally, when I watched it the second time again, I was really intentional of how I saw it, and I was at home alone, lights off. I turned like the red backlight on my TV on, and I just sat there as it happened to me. And what I loved about this film is how it just pulled me in until I was completely swallowed by it. And I know like the term slow burn is thrown around all the time, but this was like the most effective slow burn to me in the decade, where it just kept pulling me in closer and closer and closer until the ending happened. And the completely unexpected ending, I have to add to that, because it seems like throughout the film,
go on.
There's several themes that are emerging of just about the time: colonialism, immigration, religion, starvation, witch trials, patriarchy, puberty, loss, all of these things. So I mean, throughout the film I started to question myself on what was reality, what was not, and then kind of settling with the fact that, you know, all the talk of the devil and all these things weren't real. So then when it hits the climax, and then when one of the best characters of the decade finally makes his grand appearance in Black Phillip, yes, it just really threw me for a loop.
I don't want to say too much, but it's coming up. But the only thing I'm going to say, it is, for me, one of the most perfect films in existence. I love it, love it, love it, love it, love it.
And infinitely rewatchable.
Oh, yeah.
How many times you watch it, you enjoy it, and still get that creepy feeling from it.
Yeah.
You said that you weren't sure that you could tell the difference between like what's real and what's not in the movie.
Yeah, the first time, yeah.
Robert Eggers has said it's meant to be straightforward, but then again, he's like, as what's happening is literally happening, but he started dropping hints that they actually put things throughout the film that could possibly suggest a more rational reasoning for almost every event of the movie. In one shot, Korn can be seen with signs of ergo, a hallucinogenic fungus that many attribute to real-life stories of possession and witchcraft. So I've always took the film literally, for me anyway, and reading that makes me want to watch it in a completely different light. Maybe not all of it is real after all.
Yeah, I heard an interview with Eggers, and he did mention that, on how maybe there's like the slight hint that some of it might be a hallucination.
Might being the key word.
Exactly. And
I love that he doesn't clarify that, though.
And that's what I love about Eggers, too. It all comes down to this, like, fungus on the corn, that who would know about that? Like, just his attention to detail, how meticulous he is. And then, like, in the same interview, he's talking about how much time and attention went into what they were wearing, and how everything was, like, to a T, very representative of what people actually wore in that region again, in that era again. And he said every character had this pouch that people would wear at the time, and he even filled the pouches with things that they would probably have with them at the homestead, but eventually the actors, like, took them out and put their cigarettes and stuff in there. But intention was there at first.
The house was built the exact way, using the same methods and materials that a house from that era would have been built with, and I think it's like 1620 or 1630 when it takes place.
Wow.
So
they only used tools that were available back then, and they show on the special features on the Blu-ray that they talk to Salem historians who say we go to big Hollywood movies like The Crucible. They walked out of The Crucible because they could see saw marks, like modern saw blade marks in the wood. And they walked out, and they said, but this one is so accurate.
it's one of the few movies that perfectly evokes its era to the point that it looks like, even though, I mean, it's very clean in terms of the quality and the film, it looks like they could have traveled back in time to have filmed the movie. That's how authentic it is. And I think that's what makes it more believable. It feels like you're in a completely different world.
Absolutely.
That's alien to you, but feels very grounded in something real.
And also, it shouldn't understate the acting. And these
kids, wow.
The children were phenomenal. And the
little twins?
Yeah, and
the
that
creepy
scene,
little fuckers.
When the boy's dying, that is one of the most unsettling, disturbing scenes of the decade for me.
Yeah.
That, actually, I don't get goosebumps a lot, but that scene where what's happening with the little boy and when the twins are trying to pray, and then they fall down to the ground and start writhing back and forth, that scared the shit out of me, and I started to feel like I was watching something evil. Like, I wasn't watching a movie that's trying to evoke evil or present it in an objective way. I felt like this movie is fucking evil. There's evil inside the celluloid.
And the way he started saying blasphemous things while having this euphoric look on his face, it's like he had been completely consumed by the evil right before it killed him.
Absolutely.
That smile on his face as he says that thing about kiss me all over Jesus, which sounds really crude, and then he's like touching himself.
Me too.
And he looks like really demented, and his eyes widen like he sees the light. And then the expression on his face that changes before he dies looks like he's seeing something horrifying beyond your imagination. And it's so suggestive and so powerful, and I don't know how you could shoot something that well in one room and make it feel like evil is unfolding right before your eyes. Fucking impressive movie. I'll have more to say about it later.
Just
amazing.
One more thing to say from what you said. When I was growing up, my mom did not allow us to bring The Exorcist into our home. The film The Exorcist, because she believed
that's how my grandma was.
Yeah, she believed the actual tape, the actual VHS had the devil in it. So we couldn't bring it in the house. And I always thought that was silly, and that made me want to rent it even more. I never knew what she was talking about, but with The Witch and watching it at home, I had the same feeling of like, oh no, this is evil. Like, in my television, whatever, this is evil in my home, and I had that feeling. And even now, sitting here talking about it, I have the goosebumps, I have the chills.
And you know what's funny? It's one of the most divisive horror movies out there, and half of the horror audience despises this movie. I've seen people trash this up and down. I'm like, you got to be on fucking crack if you can't see
That totally took
the
me
quality. I was like, really? The Witch?
I think if you're a fan of film, you have to appreciate how brilliant this is.
Yeah.
I hate saying this, but I also think that, and Michael has said this before too, casual movie fans, not cinephiles, not necessarily horror fans, are helping to keep the horror genre alive, because it feels like films like The Witch and anything by Robert Eggers or Ari Aster or Jordan Peele seems to be enjoyed more by cinephiles in the film community at large than it is by horror fans specifically. And I find that very fascinating, and I don't know what that says.
So I remember when I watched Midsummer in the theater, when I walked out, there was a young girl sitting with her mom, and the mother is staring straight, like 1,000-yard stare, not reacting. And her daughter's telling her mom, I'm so sorry, I'm telling you, you don't have to come to movies like this with me. You don't have to come with me. You didn't have to come with me. And it just showed, like, for me, it was like a microcosm of, like, moviegoers. There's a casual moviegoer who's like, what the hell is this? And is, like, completely disturbed and, like, hating it, while the other person was, maybe apologetic, but totally passionate and really wanted to go see this work of art that was being brought to the screen.
Yeah. You remember when we brought that guy we were working with at the other
Anthony, yes. Anthony, he worked with us at Planet Hopper. We did a segment on this movie. Michael actually wrote it. It was of our segment with our host of our television series, Horror Show. Elliot did a segment that we call Watch This Movie or I'll Gut You, where he reviews horror movies from the perspective of a killer.
Yeah.
And he shot that segment with us, and he was so blown away by what Elliot said about the movie that when we were going to hang out later, he's like, show me that movie. I want to see it. If you guys say it's like evil in the celluloid, I have to see it. By the time that movie was over, he looked shook up and haunted, and he couldn't believe that what he actually saw. He was like, that fucked me up. He straight up told us that after.
Yeah.
He was in shock.
And like I said, I felt like the movie was eating me slowly, was pulling me in slowly until I was completely consumed by it. And just how, like, in the movie it depicts that Satan does that to the people. Like, it did the same thing to me. So I think that's such a great example of, like, the reaction it brings out of people.
Yeah.
Great movie. Great movie. Not great horror movie. Great fucking film, period.
And great choice.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll make a jack-o'-lantern out of your best friend's head.
All right, that brings us to our top 5. My number 5 is one that you've already mentioned on yours, so I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just say my take on it. Bone Tomahawk.
I knew it.
Nice.
It's written and directed by S. Craig Zoller, and if you want to hear more about Craig Zoller, go back to one of our podcasts.
An S. Craig Zoller spotlight we did quite a while back.
That was a lot of fun. But it's a brutal and character-driven horror western, and as far as I'm concerned, it's the best horror western ever made. Stars Kurt Russell as Sheriff Hunt, Patrick Wilson as the Doctor, Matthew Fox as as Bruder, the gunslinger, Richard Jenkins as Chicory, the aging deputy, and it also has a great little scene at the beginning with Sid Haig and David Arquette. It's a riveting character study with stellar acting from an excellent ensemble cast. It's just as strong of a western as it is a horror film. It's a slow burn thriller that goes to horrific places that are unexpected because they're so horrific.
But they always feel natural when they go there, as unexpected as it is.
And it's followed by a lot of very deliberately paced character development and character interaction, and then they just go to these horrific places, and you really feel the emotional impact of what these villains are doing to these characters. And to me, it's some of the most threatening horror villains in modern horror. And it's extremely well written, and I found out that what you see on screen is the first draft of this script. My God, I was blown away by that. Like that, you did that on a first draft? Well, apparently he's a novelist.
Yeah, he's actually he's noted for being one of the premier Western novelists working today.
Yeah. And then he did another great film at the beginning of last year, Dragged Across Concrete with Vince Vaughn and Mel Gibson. And also...
Brawl in Cell Block 99.
Yes, this is a director to watch. I absolutely love him, and that's why Bone Tomahawk is my number 5.
Really quick, before I go into my number 5, I know for some people this turns off a lot of people, but there's a very, and I'm not right-wing at all, and I'm not trying to be political, but I'm just being honest about this. There's a very right-wing bent to all of his movies that I can see pissing off a lot of people, and they piss a lot of people off. I'm not that easily offended by anything, so to me, it's kind of funny and a little playful, and kind of interesting to see movies made about characters that movies don't usually get made about. So I embrace the conservative angle of his films, but I can see that they might be a turnoff to some people because there's used some xenophobic language in a lot of his movies, very politically incorrect, and some of the things that the people say are questionable. But I think it makes the movies feel real. That's nothing about them are sanitized and is not trying to hold your hand or please you.
But he never demonizes them.
No, never demonizes them either. But I always find the conservative angle of his films interesting, if nothing else.
I've actually heard people refer to Bone Tomahawk as the first Magasploitation film.
Magasploitation film?
Right.
I've heard people complain that it's xenophobic because of how it portrays indigenous people. And I have a hard time reading that because I'm like, well, some indigenous tribes are cannibalistic, and that's not really a xenophobic thing to say. So why can't there be a film about that?
And they only attacked when somebody fucked with them.
Yeah.
It's not like they were just some horror villains out there killing people.
That's true.
They fucked with them, came in their territory, they fucked them up.
Magasploitation?
Yeah.
I have to look up the genre to see what Magasploitation actually consists of. That's something that we might want to tackle on a future podcast. Magasploitation horror. All right. Anyway, my number 5 film is a movie that was already discussed. Sergio brought up Creep, 2014, directed by Patrick Bryce. And as you already know, it's a found footage film. It is my favorite found footage film of all time. One of the few found footage films that actually feels like genuine found footage. It does this without sacrificing any of the quality in the way that it's shot and constructed, and it's cinematic without calling attention to itself. For a found footage movie, there's a lot of really good camera angles and a lot of really good lighting in it that helps to heighten the suspense, especially if you look at the cover of Creep, which is just Mark Duplass, and the camera being at the bottom of the stairs and looking up at him. When you watch that in the movie, it seems like natural, like he's just filming him, but at the same time, it's very organic and really foreboding. Mark Duplass gives one of my favorite performances of the decade as a realistic psycho. Another interesting thing about the movie that makes it impressive, there's no script for this at all. They didn't have a script, just a bare bones outline that included stuff like driving a car while videotaping a dialogue of the trip. So that's all improvisation, and it all feels really natural. And since the movie was it was actually based on a series of conversations between It was based on a series of conversations between Patrick Bryce and Mark Duplass, and as the movie was being shot, they were constantly screening the footage for their friends, and all of their friends convinced them to push the psychological black comedy further into the realm of horror. So a lot of it had to do with testing it with friends that they could push up the horror angles. This was originally meant to be more of a straight black comedy than it ended up being. And I could kind of see that in the way that the film goes, because it starts off as black comedy and slowly becomes scary. I'm surprised that it wasn't designed that way from the beginning, because it seems really intentional and it manages to make it flow really well. There's also footage of at least 3 alternate endings. I would love to see these alternate endings and what they are. But as it is, I feel like the ending that it ends with is perfect.
Yeah.
I can't imagine a better ending. Yeah. So one of the best found footage films, my favorite found footage film of all time. And another great horror movie that it scared me because it's realistic. Mm-hmm. I felt that from the situation of the videographer, from his viewpoint, I feel like any one of us could end up in that type of situation if we weren't careful. Everything about it seems realistic. Everything about it is completely within the realm of possibility. I don't find anything far-fetched about this movie at all. Great horror movie, creepy, scary, well shot, good found footage. Love it. Creep 2014.
Now, I've always known Mark Duplass as being like a comedic actor. So just having, I wouldn't say he was typecasted, but having that type in my head while I watched it really added to the horror to me personally. Yeah. So hearing that he intended it to be a black comedy at first and then he just kept pushing it further makes so much sense. And I love that he did because it was so effective.
And it feels natural, too.
Absolutely.
And it was weird. It feels like a very thought-out and constructed movie. So I was actually shocked to learn that there was no script and it was all very loosely improvised. Really impressed. I don't think Creep 2 was shot that way. I could be wrong. I'd have to look into it. But I imagine that they had a more clear idea what they were going to do with the sequel. And supposedly there's a third one coming out. I can't wait for it. It's supposed to be a trilogy. I hope we get it. I can see 5 more of these films and it wouldn't bother me.
Absolutely. So now my number 5 film is Train to Busan 2016.
That was one of my honorable mentions last week.
Yeah, so I know it was discussed here already. So just very briefly, again, this was another film that really impacted me emotionally. This is one film that once I finished watching it, it just stuck with me and really moved me. I saw it as just a great family drama within the context of the zombie apocalypse. So the story is the dad and his daughter and what they're going through. And that little girl's a great actress too. Yeah. She did a great job. And what also added to the emotion for me was how realistic it was in everyone's reactions. It kind of showed all signs of human nature. It showed people coming together. It showed self-preservation. It showed self-sacrifice, the sabotage, teamwork. It just showed so realistically how different types of people would have reacted in this situation.
Yeah. It's one of those horror movies that's actually kind of inspiring.
Oh, yeah.
For you see the way that you see people rise to the occasions in the face of the most unimaginably awful situation.
And if you don't cry at that movie, you don't have a heart.
Oh yeah,
It's very grounded in a lot of humanity, which I think is absent from a lot of horror. And I don't mind horror movies don't have to have humanity for me to appreciate them, because I'm a sick fuck. But it is nice when you start to care deeply about the characters the way that you do in Train to Busan. And I thought it was, in addition to being visceral and exciting, it was a very touching film.
I think that's what it was for me too. And like, at the risk of sounding cheesy, it was like being inspired by the love and having that love making me feel like inspired to go do better. Like, just the relationship.
Fucking hippie.
Yeah, whatever. I'm just kidding. That relationship between the father and daughter was just so touching and so moving. And I think that's the part that was so inspiring.
I love the way the zombies reanimated.
Oh yeah.
Like they were contortionists who would go up from the ground unnaturally.
I also think that the humanity of this movie elevates it, because I don't think the horror would be as scary if the audience didn't have such a strong emotional connection with the characters, if they weren't so endeared to the relationships.
Oh yeah.
It wouldn't mean nearly as much without all of that.
Yeah, so that was my number 5, Train to Busan.
Great choice.
All right, now we're down to my number 4. This is not only my number 4 of the decade, it's one of my favorite horror films of all time. The Conjuring from 2013, directed by the great James Wan, written by Chad and Carrie Hayes. And this was the first film that Wan did without Lee Winnell, which was his go-to guy for the first few films. And Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson are perfectly cast as the Warrens. Lily Taylor and Joey King and Ron Livingston are also very good as the Perron family. It's set in Rhode Island in 1971, and it brought a fresh and visceral scare to the haunted house subgenre, where you thought everything had been done. But it's also an excellent period piece. It's jump scares done right. I think James Wan is a master of jump scares, and I hate when people complain saying he's nothing but jump scares. This is just one of the things that he does well, and he does it very well, and he does it better than anyone else, I think. Well-crafted scares with a masterful setup as well. It's got great drama, it's highly emotional, has an air of authenticity, great cinematography that's modeled after 70s horror. Excellent score from Joe Bishara, who also played a demonic figure in the movie, and he is also the same guy who played the lipstick demon in Insidious. So that was pretty cool that the guy who, the composer who did the score, was the lipstick demon. And to me it feels like the Warrens. I was very familiar with the Warrens ever since high school. I did a paper on them in high school. So I was very familiar with them, and it felt like it was them. The story felt like the stories that I read on the Warrens. It made me feel the same feelings that I felt when I read those stories. And it features the Annabelle doll for the first time. And they made it kind of a scary looking porcelain doll, but it was actually a Raggedy Ann doll. And
I think the Raggedy Ann doll is creepier.
Yeah.
For me, anyway.
And this was used to set up the history of the Warrens. And I thought it was really cool that this got an R rating just for being scary. And when they asked the MPA, they didn't actually want this to be R. They were hoping for kind of a PG-13 rating, and they got an R. So they asked for clarification from the MPAA, and this is exactly what the MPAA said. The film is so scary that there were no cuts or edits possible that would make it a viable PG-13 film, and I agree with that 100%. I don't often agree with the MPAA, but I do.
What a bunch of fucking saps.
But I thought the history of this, you could really feel the history of the true story in the film too, because it's 8 generations of families lived in this house that this movie is about. So 8 generations of families lived and died in this house. There was suicides, poisonings, all this you can look it up. Poisonings, there was a rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl. There was 2 drownings. 4 men were froze to death. And in reality, the Warrens actually left the house and could not help the family, even though James Wan kind of twisted it around and made it where they were the heroes, but they did not help them. And when Wan was working on the script, he had a new puppy, and the puppy started staring at an empty spot in the room, and it started growling aggressively. And then the puppy's head slowly went across the room, following some unseen force as it moved across the room. And then also the 2 writers, the Hayes brothers, they were also writers on it. When they were working on the script, they were speaking with Lorraine Warren over the phone, who was going over different details of the script. and every time they were on the phone with her, they would get strange noises and static, and it would disconnect suddenly. So there was a lot of some of it could have been some of the stories on this film about the filming of it, them bringing a priest to the set to bless it.
Did they eat corn?
No.
Okay.
And a lot of people having experiences on the set. I think some of it might have been glorified to help the
Marketing.
reputation and marketing of the movie. But some of these stories were really scary. And I think, like I said, reading these stories back in high school, this movie gave me the same feeling. And you can really tell that Lorraine Warren was very close to the production, because it feels like it. And that's why The Conjuring is my number 4.
That's a real crowd pleaser movie. I remember when I went to go see it. I went to go see it with a group of friends after work on opening night. We were all drunk by the time we showed up. I had such a blast watching it because the audience was packed, and man, that was receptive. You hear people screaming and like jumping and everything. Made it such a great experience for me. And the success of the movie is a big part of what's made horror more mainstream and more viable. Yeah. As much as a lot of horror fans hate on The Conjuring because it's so crowd pleasing, it brought horror to a much more mainstream level, and I feel like it helped, the success of it helped deepen the appreciation of it. And the fact that there's a Conjuring universe in the same way that there's a Marvel universe or a DC universe speaks to how much these movies really connect with people.
Yeah, and I would rather have a well-told story than I would a crowd-pleasing horror film. So I usually don't lean toward crowd-pleasing horror films, but this is one of the scariest, if not the scariest, crowd-pleasing horror films I've ever seen, besides Part 2. Spoiler alert.
And that's another thing. As much as I liked the first one, I feel like the second one outdid it by a couple miles for me.
Yeah, for sure.
It extended what was good and made it even creepier and more dread-filled and more suspenseful.
Yeah.
My number 4 film is the one that Michael already mentioned, The Cabin in the Woods. It is a gleefully unhinged blast from start to finish and a love letter to the horror genre and its fans. It lightly sends up the genre while celebrating it for being gloriously fun and inventive. I feel like Sergio said earlier, this was the Scream of our generation, and in some ways it's more wild and anarchic than Scream was, because Scream was playing to very specific slasher movie tropes, and you definitely see that in here, but I feel like almost every type of movie monster gets their own little tribute throughout the movie. So if you're a horror fan, you see like, oh, there's the Hellraiser reference, there's this, there's that. All of the characters are really funny. I love that they play up the stereotypes of what horror characters are. The jock, the slut, the stoner, the clown, the virgin, and it kind of twists those expectations to the point where the whole point of the movie is kind of about the horror audience itself. I'm going to spoil this a little bit because it's kind of important for me to get to what I think about the movie. All these teenagers are in a manipulated situation where a group of people, scientists in a lab or whatever you want to call them, are manipulating a situation to evoke horror movies like The Evil Dead and Friday the 13th. You even get the ominous old man giving a warning in the movie in the same way. And it plays with these conventions because they do it for these characters that they call the gods, and they want to be entertained by this. So they want to see slaughter, they want to see the virgin live to the end, they want to see all of this, and if it doesn't go right, it pisses them off. That's the horror audience right there, who expects the exact same formula, and whenever it's subverted, they get pissed off and they throw a tantrum. So it's a perfect metaphor for the horror audience, and it kind of makes fun of that a little bit while also celebrating it, saying, God, you people are fucking frustrating, but man, we gotta love you because of how much you elevate this genre. So for me, it's just a really fun movie. Another interesting thing about Marty the Stoner, played by Fran Kranz. During the lake scene, he was the only one not to jump in the lake and the only one to be fully clothed on the dock. The reason is because he was in better shape than all the other male students. The writers joked that he looked like a ripped, muscular Jesus, and that if he were to be shown with his shirt off, it would ruin what the character's supposed to be, which is like some lanky stoner, and that's why they gave his character baggier clothes. So Fran, apparently he doesn't really look like that in real life. Like I said earlier, the coffee mug is actually real and functional. I want one. All of the makeup effects are incredible in this movie. They're really inventive. They're really fun. I love Richard Jenkins in this movie. And the opening of the movie was a deliberate attempt by Drew Goddard and Joss Whedon to make the audience think that they walked into the wrong film. And it worked, because when I first saw this, I was almost on the verge of getting up. I'm like, I think we walked into the wrong movie. It just seems like a fucking movie about the workspace in the office. And they start cackling, and then you see the Cabin in the Woods title pop. You're like, what the hell kind of opening to a movie is this?
Great.
Not the scariest horror movie. There are horror films that scared me a lot more than this one, but no other film brought me as much joy as Cabin in the Woods in the 2010s. Totally reinvents everything about the genre while celebrating it. Anarchic, fun, glorious, great movie.
I love the merman too.
Oh man! And apparently in test screenings, that was what people that was the scene that the audience responded to the best. That whenever people filled out those cards that they're supposed to fill out, everybody said that was their favorite scene in the movie.
And my favorite part of it too is something you mentioned, how watching was almost like a greatest hits, and like, you know, pointing out all the references and how fun that was, and it ends with the audience seeing themselves in the film.
Yeah, because they're the gods, the ones pissed off that the virgin didn't live to the end, or this didn't happen. And what's cool is this movie actually subverts a lot of cliches and switches things up a little bit, especially with Marty the stoner character.
Yeah.
Loved his trajectory.
Yeah, I love that ending. You think they all got out, and then boom.
As an open pothead myself, I gotta love any horror film that ends with the character smoking a joint.
So my number 4 is Tigers Are Not Afraid, 2017, directed by Issa Lopez. I know you've discussed this one already, so I'll just give you my thoughts.
Moving.
It was incredible. Okay, so this film, I watched it by myself, and when it was over, I sat in my chair for like 10 minutes, didn't move, and just wept. I just couldn't help it. I just cried.
It reminded me almost of what it was like to watch Pan's Labyrinth for the first time.
Absolutely.
And it took me that, but it doesn't feel like a rip-off of that.
And I was just so impressed by the young actors. They're all first-time actors, and I was listening to an interview with Issa Lopez, I think on Shockwaves, and she said that the actors, the children never saw a script. They never knew what it was about. They never knew what was going to happen. She would just direct them every single day. And while she was directing them, she would tell them about the fantasy elements. Like, oh, a tiger's going to appear here on this wall. And the children were so excited about it. And that's kind of what motivated them to keep going. And ultimately, she was concerned about, like, the nature of the film and would it be appropriate for them. And at the premiere, their parents let them watch it, and they loved it. But they were mostly excited just to see where, like, the fantasy elements were going to be added into the film. And I just thought that was a great story.
What's interesting about her ability to direct child actors that well is she's calling upon these children to play emotions that their life experience may not be. They might not have enough life experience to understand the depth of certain emotions. So that's what makes the performances really surprising for me.
Absolutely. And just watching them just completely broke my heart. And the subject matter is real. And that's what elevated it for me. But like you said, these actors probably never really experienced that. So the fact that they could pull that off was so impressive. And I just have to also mention that just seeing these stories being represented and being loved and being viewed by everyone felt so good, because that's where I come from. That's my culture. My family's from Mexico. So seeing a filmmaker telling stories from there and seeing how it's impacting people across cultures, just everywhere, was just really moving for me too, and it really brought like a huge sense of pride for me. What I liked most about Issa Lopez's direction is how she was able to find beauty in everything. She found beauty in tragedy and the decay of the city. There was always like
it's a very Mexican sensibility. It doesn't feel like it could come from an American filmmaker. The sense of love and the romanticism is very much part of Mexican culture.
Absolutely, because even like if you speak to like a Mexican family, a lot of the nostalgia comes from suffering. A lot of like what people are proud of comes from how they grew from the pain that they went through. So I do see that in a lot of Mexican cinema, where we see a city in decay. In other cultures, like American films, it would be just that, like a bland, bleak place. Whereas there, it's still beautiful.
I feel like American films try to emphasize how ugly and bleak they are. And Mexican films try to find the beauty in the shittiest situations, which is what happens in a lot of Guillermo del Toro movies.
And yet, there's little optimism here.
That's true.
Yeah. So in like the imagery, we get that sense of like there's beauty and like in the damage, there's beauty in the decay, but in the story, like that doesn't happen at all.
I kind of feel that the end, I wouldn't say it's an optimistic ending, but it's hopeful. It's very hopeful for the future. It kind of lifts the film for me, and much like Gerald's Game, I think it's an inspiring story of survival and fortitude in the face of the most awful situation that you could imagine as a human being.
But it still leaves you with a broken heart.
Oh yeah.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
My number 3 is one that's been mentioned on the show already. From 2015, The Witch, written and directed by Robert Eggers. I won't say too much about this. I'll just say what it means to me.
Say as much as you want, Michael.
Sergio already said the synopsis. I won't say it again. But just what I loved about it, the score. The score is the main thing that stood out to me and the main thing that scared me. And it kind of was there during every frightening moment for me to make it more frightening. I love the directing. The acting was all spot on. It's strange and it holds up on repeat viewings. It's spine-tingling. It's amazing cinematography from Jaron Blasky, who also did The Lighthouse. And
The White House? That's its own horror movie.
I know. But it's amazing to me that he used almost all natural light in The Witch, and it's beautiful. It's an engaging slow burn with expert pacing, an explosive climax that's a shift in tone from the rest of the movie, but it still works for me. And Anna Taylor-Joy, I can't say enough about her performance in this, and it's completely fascinating character arc, which is similar to Carrie. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize that until repeat viewings, how similar her character arc was to Carrie. But it's just fascinating to watch. And Black Phillip is my idol. And I found out he was supposed to be in a handful of other scenes, but he would not behave. He wasn't as trained as well as they told him he was. And he would go completely wild, which is strange to me because they had that thing like bucking up around children. And
so it sounds like a dangerous set. An untrained goat.
It's a big, huge goat with big horns, and we used to have goats, so I used to fight our goats. I used to run from the other end of the pen, and we'd meet in the middle, and I'd shoulder bump their heads, their horns, and if I would have had one as big as Philip, he would have knocked me on my ass.
Black Phillip is one of the premier horror icons of the horror renaissance. Just have you seen the fan art, the posters for Black Phillip? Really good stuff.
Yeah, and I love that piece that's at the Mystic Museum. There's a Black Phillip piece there. It's beautiful. It goes from floor to ceiling, and it's just this big life-size Black Phillip. So so many reasons, all the ones we already mentioned, and we've discussed this movie to death, but it's well worth it.
We're going to discuss it more, though. It's okay.
I love The Witch from 2015. It's my number 3 of the decade.
Number 3. Good choice. My number 3 movie of the decade is from 2017. Now I'm going to clarify. The best horror film of 2017 was Get Out. For me, this is the Night of the Living Dead of the 21st century. It signaled Jordan Peele as one of the definitive new voices of the horror genre. Brilliantly creepy with savage social satire that perfectly expresses the themes in a horrifying way. The casual, almost clueless racism is very realistic, as we mentioned earlier. It's slightly exaggerated, but the exaggeration helps to gently slip it into the realm of horror without ever looking ridiculous. It's Hitchcockian in the way that it delicately mounts suspense throughout its entire runtime. Each uncomfortable and awkward situation slowly builds unease that at first seems a little bit funny, a little bit awkward, and it gets to a point where it's absolutely terrifying. I think it's a beautifully shot film, elegant and classical in its filmmaking and its framing. It's a little bit like a lot of the classic horror movies we love. The surreal imagery that creeps in around the edges only heightens the sense of unease that creeps in throughout the movie. It's not only suspenseful and creepy, but it's also darkly humorous. And we said a lot about this movie earlier. This is a groundbreaking film for the horror genre. You don't see enough films, you don't see black people represented in the horror genre enough. Because in my experience, experience, some of the most dedicated horror fans are black horror fans. And I've always found it interesting that black people love horror movies so much, but they rarely ever see themselves actually represented on screen. And that must be a joy, because I actually saw this movie on opening night, which is a great experience with an almost all-black audience. Everybody was so appreciative. Everybody was laughing at all the right moments, getting scared at all the right moments. I heard people saying, "Oh, I know what that's like," or people relating to the awkward conversations as the main character, as Daniel Kaluuya meets the family of his girlfriend Rose. It's also historical because it's the highest grossing debut film based on an original screenplay. Jordan Peele became the first African American writer, producer, and director to earn more than $100 million in a debut film. It stayed in the U.S. box office top 10 for its first 2 months of release. And the film was only made for $4.5 million. And on its opening weekend alone, it made $34 million and recouped its budget back right away. And it's one of those movies that became a word-of-mouth hit, where it did have a solid opening, but what made it so strong is that everybody kept talking about it and encouraging everybody to go see it. So it stood on the charts for a very long time. Excellent film, funny, insightful, satirical, scary, suspenseful, a beautifully crafted piece of filmmaking, the work of an expert filmmaker, wholly original while still being indebted to a lot of different inspirations, and it brought a new voice to the horror genre that I absolutely cherish in Jordan Peele. Get Out is one of the defining horror films of the decade and one of the best horror films of the decade, and I don't think any horror list is complete. Any top 10 horror list is incomplete without Get Out. Shame on you, Michael.
And
I'm kidding.
I'm surprised we haven't mentioned the score. The score is incredible as well. And I think the strings, because most of the score is strings, the strings really do a lot to add to the tension of the film. I remember my friend gifted me the vinyl. It's a waxwork one, which is awesome. It has like a bingo card insert and everything. Yeah. But he gave me the vinyl, and at first I was, not being able to really remember what the score was and wondering what it was, and I threw it on, and I just fell in love with it then. I think it adds so much to the tension building and just the film in general.
It also has a really quirky sensibility.
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe it, but it's another one of those debut movies where the filmmaker behind it had a very clear, very well-formulated voice from the beginning. It doesn't feel like the work of a filmmaker in training or somebody to find his voice. I think Jordan Peele arrived on the scene fully formed as an artist, and I think a lot of that had to do with working on Key and Peele so long. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I was actually anticipating this very heavily from the first time I heard about it, because I watched a lot of Key and Peele, and they do a lot of parodies and spoofs of a lot of horror movies and a lot of films in general, that when I heard it announced that he was going to do a horror movie, I thought, it's probably going to be really good, because I know for a fact that this guy is a huge movie fan and has studied all of the classics, and it met all of my expectations of what I thought I would get out of it.
Have you been able to watch horror noir?
Yeah, I did. I fucking loved it. I've always had a tough time placing it on the horror list because I don't know where I would fit in a documentary, which is probably smart that you fit in a documentary category. Mike and I both watched horror noir. You watched it too, right? Yeah. But we never discussed it on the podcast because, we'll discuss it at some point, but the documentary deals with such a large subject matter that I feel like that would need its own podcast. And not only that, I still haven't seen Ganja and Hess yet. I want to see Ganja and Hess before I get into tackling the history of black horror on film.
And there's way too many movies that I haven't seen on there.
Yeah, it's
so many I need to see before I discuss
a big blind spot, because that documentary made me realize that even though black people are very underrepresented in the horror genre, despite being such big fans of it, there is a richer history there than we realize, and a lot of things that flew under the radar. So for that reason alone, the first time I watched the documentary, I did it with the intention of discussing it on this podcast, but I thought I need to prepare before I even dare to delve, go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, and I only mention it because in watching it, it just shows how deep Jordan Peele's knowledge of horror goes.
Yeah.
And how much he knows about it. And really impressive. And even when he's talking about some of like the racial undertones of Get Out that aren't as obvious, like how he uses the buck's head to like separate himself from whoever was following him. Yeah. And he talks about how that's reminiscent of like, I think he mentioned roots or just like back in the day how a lot of slaves were referred to as bucks, like the big stronger male.
There's a lot of symbolism in the movie
Absolutely.
like that where the part where he's picking cotton out of the couch and covering his ears so he doesn't get hypnotized, that's obviously a reference to the back when slaves used to pick cotton. Mm-hmm. And in this instance, he's using a thing that's been a source of humiliation and turning it on its head and using it against the villains of the movie. And it's also, I don't normally go for, I prefer ambiguity in movies in general, and I don't like clear-cut endings. And as far as the horror genre goes, I could go without happy endings, and that's kind of what I love about the endings of films like The Witch and Hereditary. But I don't think that Get Out would be nearly as effective if it didn't end on a positive note. Because the way that the movie ends, the first time I saw it, I don't want to ruin it, but when the cops showed up, my heart dropped. Yeah. Because I knew what the situation is going to look like. And when it ends on a positive note and a more hopeful note, you go out of the theater feeling stronger or a little bit more empowered. And I saw the alternate ending that Jordan Peele shot, which is a lot more bleak.
Yeah.
I don't think it works nearly as well. And I also think in the times that we're living in, it was better to end that movie on a more positive note. And I love it, dude. It's not the type of ending I typically go for, but I couldn't picture a better ending for a movie like Get Out than to have it end so triumphantly.
All right, so now we're moving on to my number 3, which is The Conjuring from 2013. And this, again, could have just as easily been The Conjuring 2.
So you like the first one more?
For me, it's hard to decide. It's hard to decide, and I'll tell you why I picked the first one. I picked it primarily for the sheer cultural impact that it's had. Yeah. And I cannot understate how much about the genre The Conjuring changed. And it brought in a lot of mainstream people into horror, even for horror fans. Like you were mentioning, it did a lot of service to us as well. It started the rise of Blumhouse. It started the Conjuring universe. And for that alone, I have to put this in my top 3. And even though the Conjuring universe has had some hit or misses, I just love what they try to do. Like you look at Annabelle. Annabelle has its issues, but then Annabelle Comes Home was great. Or I'm gonna go for it, The Curse of La Llorona, which was not a good film, and yet I'm so glad that it exists because these are stories that I heard growing up from my family.
Yeah. I was so excited to hear that because growing up in Mexican culture, you always hear about La Llorona, and I've heard that so much. I was genuinely shocked when I heard that they were going to make a movie about that. I was like, what? I was like, they never make movies about Mexican folklore or anything like that. So I was happy to hear. I mean, even the movie didn't turn out the way that we could have hoped it would have turned out. I'm just happy that the story was told at all.
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking the same thing. I'm just really happy that something from my childhood that had meant so much to me was like up there on the big screen, and it was so surreal to hear them talking about it. And even a lot of the criticisms people had of like how unrealistic or cheesy it was, like a lot of the things that people criticized were actually like big parts of like Mexican folklore, like I forgot like the curandero guy that they use, who's like a burning sage, and they're talking about how lame that is, but it's like that's what we do.
Yeah.
And just seeing that was really refreshing, even though I wasn't totally content with the movie. I'm glad it was there.
Even though it was about a white family.
Yeah, they're half
white.
That was one of the main issues I had, but I'm a huge Freaks and Geeks fan, so I got to give them a pass for that.
A quick side note, do you like Paranormal Activity marked ones?
I did like the marked ones.
I love
quite
it.
a bit.
It's my favorite one of the whole series.
Paranormal Activity is another one that I loved the first one just for the sheer impact it had, and it was probably one of my best movie-going experiences.
Oh, man. That's unforgettable.
Great. Yeah, it just everyone screaming. It was so hilarious.
I was so excited when I went to go see it because the way that it rolled out was really slow. You had to request it at your theater if you wanted to see it.
Yeah.
And I took my cousin to go see it, and he was trying to act tough, and he was like laughing his ass off at how stupid he thought it was for a good majority of the runtime. And then by the end of the movie, when the demon is crawling towards the camera, he was covering his hands over his face saying, "Don't look at me, bitch, don't look at me." One of the most best moments I've ever had in a movie theater.
Don't look at me, bitch.
Yeah,
right.
Shout out to my cousin Gage. I was really scared and you deflated it, but it was memorable.
Oh man, that was one of my favorite movie going experiences ever. And
Yeah.
So that's why it has to be my top of the franchise, but the marked ones is definitely my number 2. I love the marked ones as well.
Yeah, and a lot of people said that the acting was horrible and
No.
the characters were unrealistic. It was very realistic, and I know people just like that.
I know enough shitty Mexican teens to know that it's real.
But The Conjuring.
But The Conjuring, yeah. So again, just the cultural impact, the whole James Wan universe, the Conjuring universe. That's why it's my number 3.
Definitely brought horror to the mainstream.
Yes.
And I am so in love with the Conjuring movies. That brings us to our final 2, and my number 2 is Sinister from 2012, directed and co-written by Scott Derrickson, who also did Exorcism of Emily Rose, another excellent movie, and he went on to do Doctor Strange, which is not so excellent, but still a good movie. It's co-written by C. Robert Cargill, who wrote this based on a nightmare that he had after watching The Ring, and it stars Ethan Hawke and Juliet Rylance. There's also James Ranson, plays the deputy, who he was also in part 2, and he was in It Chapter 2. And Fred Dalton Thompson as the sheriff was a really good character. And it's about a true crime writer who moves his family in a house where murders occurred as he tries to write a book on them to revive his career. And he finds a box of Super 8 home movies that feature several murders that send him into a spiral, and a spiral of evil that's perpetuated by the demon Bagul. I love the snuff films in this one. That's one of the main things that makes it a genuinely scary film. And the way Ethan Hawke reacts to those snuff films is the scariest part of the film for me, because he acts like he is truly petrified, and it looks like he is experiencing real terror. And I love how the snuff films, they're half family home movies, and then the other half is showing them brutally murdered. I just thought it was very effective. And I love the score, absolutely love the score. That's one of the main things that makes this scary too. The score is by Christopher Young, but he mixed it with sounds that the writer Cargill, he found on the internet, including a song by Boards of Canada. So I thought that was a very effective way to mix the score. I love the atmosphere, the scares were solid. It was a really good horror villain in Bagul. And it was a similar villain to Pennywise in the way he manipulates children, and he's kind of an enigmatic type of entity, and you don't know exactly how much power he has. The ghost children were scary and cool. The family drama was riveting and effective, and especially some of the fights between Ethan Hawke and his wife were excellent and just gripping and very interesting. And the taunting of Ethan Hawke in this is phenomenal. You just feel his frustration, you feel the horror that he feels. Everything that he feels in that movie I felt, and that's why it's so scary to me. And this is another one where the filmmakers wanted a PG-13, so there's almost no cursing and no sex in it, but it's still got an R rating, and I can see why by watching it, because it still scares me. After watching it several times, I still get scared watching it. And interesting little tidbit about this, the snuff film where it shows the family hanging, the coordinator that set it up made a mistake, and the stuntmen were really hung and choked, and but they survived, but the coordinator was fired soon after that. So that makes that scene even scarier for me. Whoa. So that's why I love Sinister 2012. It's my number 2 of the decade.
Excellent movie. That's a fascinating little tidbit.
Yeah.
And I'm going to look at that scene a lot differently when I see it again.
Yeah, so when they're squirming up there, they're really choking their asses off.
All in the name of art.
Yep.
Yeah.
My number 2 is Hereditary, a movie we already discussed from Ari Aster.
That's also my number 2.
And you know what? I kind of had a feeling it was going to be your number 2, and I was like, I bet it's going to be his number 2. What can I say about Hereditary that I haven't already said? I'll say this. The first time I went to go see it, which is another experience, I'm glad I got to see it on opening night, I felt like I was seeing a new classic being resurrected before my eyes. I felt like I was watching I knew that this is like Rosemary's Baby, The Shining, The Exorcist, Night of the Living Dead. I was like, I instantly knew it was going to go on, be part of the horror canon. It was going to be very important. I was actually kind of shocked at the backlash that this movie got. Michael warned me that people weren't going to love it, and I said, there's no way this movie's going to be divisive. It's way too damn good. And come to find out, it's just as divisive as The Witch.
Yep.
It doubles as a frightening horror flick and a brutally honest look at human grief and pain. The film would be traumatic and harsh without any of the horror in it. If you were just to reduce this movie to just a straight drama, it would be equally disturbing and unsettling. The supernatural aspects flow organically out of the harsh portrayal of grief and misery, and since the drama aspects are so heavy and so overwhelming and they hurt so much, the supernatural elements become much more rough, distressing, and jarring when they actually kick in. And because you already feel that you're in such an emotionally overwhelmed state, the movie makes you feel almost vulnerable in its exploration of emotions, that when all the more supernatural things start to creep in, it becomes doubly horrifying. One of the best images in 2010's horror is when Alex Wolff wakes up and you see Toni Collette in the corner of the room. And at first you don't really notice her because it's so dark, but then when the camera lingers on it so long that you're just forced to look at the image, and then you realize that Toni Collette is in the corner all the way up, like all the way in the ceiling in the corner. And when that detail comes and hits you, it makes your heart skip. You're like, holy shit. Totally scary movie. Probably one of the best acted horror movies ever. Maybe the best acted horror movie ever. I know that's a big statement to make, but when you have a performance like Toni Collette's, I don't see how it's not really that much of a stretch for me to say it. Toni Collette should have been nominated for an Oscar, should have been up for every award, and she was up for a lot of critics awards, but that was not only worthy of a nomination, it should have won. There was not a single better performance from an actress in 2018 than Toni Collette's performance in Hereditary, and it's indicative of the elitism and snobbery of the Academy.
I can never honestly say that I don't care about awards, because to this day I'm so angry she didn't even get nominated.
I think it's absolutely absurd. And what's interesting, Toni Collette had told her agent that she didn't want to do any more like heavy films, more dark films, because she'd done so many. But when she read the script for Hereditary, she said, okay, I'll make an exception for this because it's that good. And she also said that Ari Aster was the most prepared filmmaker that she's ever worked with in her life. As I said earlier in this movie, I think it's effective because it's a film that wants to hurt you, and I think it does, because some of the awkward relationships between the family, I've liked that, and I'd hate to admit this on the podcast, but the dinner scene between Toni Collette and Gabriel Byrne and Alex Wolff, where there's tension between the mom and the son, I've had a couple of moments like that in real life. And I actually watched this movie with my mom. One time I showed it to her around Halloween, and she said, show me a horror movie that's actually going to scare me. And it worked, but I wasn't thinking about it, but I was like, we just kind of looked at each other and we just kept watching the movie. And obviously, me and my mom actually have a wonderful relationship, but life has its ups and downs, so I could relate to a lot of it. Ari Aster said he wanted to make a film about suffering that took suffering seriously. And the level of grief in this movie is shocking, because I don't feel enough movies portray grief in its raw honesty. I feel like a lot of it's sanitized. When Toni Collette is crying on the floor, crying for her daughter and like screaming, that is so awful. And when the camera pans over to see Alex Wolff, her son, standing there being haunted because he feels like it's his fault, absolutely fucking devastated me and destroyed me. So I felt vulnerable the whole movie. The horror crept in and it scared the shit out of me. Ari Aster filmed this in Utah because he thought its mountains are beautiful and breathtaking, but also menacing and ominous. I couldn't agree more. And Aster actually wrote biographies for every character before he wrote the script for this movie. So each character, in Ari Aster's view, has a very detailed backstory and biography. I would like to read those biographies one day. It seems pretty interesting. It's a perfect horror movie. It feels like it's in the vein of some of the best, most classic horror films in history. It's scary. It's emotionally devastating. And like I said, Toni Collette alone is enough to make this one of the best acted, if not the best acted horror movie in history. But Alex Wolff is also good enough that he could have been nominated for Best Supporting Actor from this movie. I feel like a lot of people were shitting on Gabriel Byrne, saying that he didn't rise to the occasion. I strongly disagree. I think his performance is more understated because of the character as he is, since he's trying to be, take hold of the situation and be the strong one for the family. He felt like a realistic person, because I know a lot of fathers who are like that, who will bear the brunt of the pain and hide it so the family doesn't have to deal with it. And that moment when he's overwhelmed and he's at the stoplight and he's starting to think about everything that he's been going through and how it's ruining his life, and he starts to shed a little tear, felt really realistic to me. So I thought his performance was wonderful in the movie. I also, Millie Shapiro, oh my God, creepy ass little girl. They could have not found anybody better for it.
Who's going to do it?
I know. Ann Dowd. Oh man, scares the shit out of me. Ann Dowd as the creepy cult lady. Ooh. Oh my God, loved her in this movie.
Yeah.
For anybody else who hasn't seen her, watch The Leftovers. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's an HBO show. Because of the character she plays on that movie, the instant I saw her in this one, I was like, oh no, Ann Dowd's here. That's bad news. Perfect in all the right ways. One of the standout horror films of the 2010s. Emotional, devastating, scary, haunting, elegantly filmed, and the way that it really explores emotions that most filmmakers would be scared to go towards. Ari Aster is indeed a very sick man, and I love him for it. Hereditary, my number 2 choice, and apparently
it's mine as well. And I'm still really shocked it's not my number 1. It's just something didn't let me put it there, but I think I know why now. Okay. We had to go together. But this is, just like you said, one of those that really, really pulled me in and hurt me. Mm-hmm. And just left like a lasting impression on me. And as I was watching it, I had the same experience where I just knew I was watching something amazing. I knew I was watching a new masterpiece. And it was a classic. I was just opening myself to the experience, knowing that this is going to be something I was going to always remember. And I actually saw this with our friend Sylvester, and that scene when Toni Collette's in the corner of the room, he just like nudged me. He's like, "Look up!" And when I looked up, it felt like someone punched me in the chest. That was terrifying. I was like, "Oh my gosh!" But this is just like a family drama, which is very patient, very slow, and very painful. And then when it hits, and it is terrifying. And the crescendo is like none I've ever seen before. And just that one image of Alex Wolff laying in bed, just with his eyes open, just that 1,000-yard stare, that haunted me for weeks.
You know why that really got to me? Because it was, for me, an extremely realistic reaction to the situation. He seemed so shell-shocked that what happened was beyond his comprehension, and he could barely process what he just did. And what's interesting is that the movie hints that it's going to go somewhere pretty awful. You know something bad is going to happen. And when it happens, it's even worse than you could have imagined. You're like, oh, fuck, I knew it was going to be bad, but god damn, did it have to be that rough?
Yeah.
Oh, man, so powerful.
And then upon the rewatch, you see all the signs. You see everything that's being foretold. Yeah. And that's why I'm not shocked to find out how well prepared Ari Aster was. Because this is
littered with detail.
Littered with foreshadowing. Just like Midsummer's the same way. But this film I can watch over and over again. And it's always a new experience. Because I'm always looking for something new that he's hiding in the film to tell us, that's going to tell us what's to come. Or it's just going to add another layer of depth to the story.
And didn't the first scene of Midsommar remind you of Toni Collette's grief in Hereditary? Like, he took both of those actresses he probably had them recall some of the most devastating moments of their lives to get that out of them. But it was both realistic, like, intense grief.
The acting in this movie also looks painful and looks like it hurts. It looks like it would take a lot out of you. And apparently Alex Wolff had to go to therapy after because he suffered PTSD from the experience of the movie. Yep. And there's that one scene in the classroom where he's raising his hand and it looks like it's supposed to be a scene where it seems like they're weakening his body for it to be possessed.
Yeah.
It looks like it's actually happening. You could tell that there's no effects going on and it looks painful as hell. I can only imagine the experience it would be like to have to act that out and put that on camera without any effects at all.
And I'm not an actor, but I act in some of my movies, and I acted in my first movie, and I had to imagine that I had to kill all my friends in the movie, and I had to imagine that they all did something so bad to me that I really wanted to kill them, and it really affected me emotionally. It deeply affected me, so I can just imagine what actors like Alex Wolff and
Toni Collette
went through in a movie like this.
Oh, yeah.
If Alex Wolff needed therapy, I should have just looked at Gabriel Byrne because he was in that HBO show
In Treatment. I wasn't going to bring. Have you seen that show?
I have.
I love that show.
It's great.
I'm such a big fan. I think that I know there's nothing to do with the horror genre, but that show is so underrated, so fascinating. I've seen it about 3 times now. Fucking love that show. I don't know of any other show where it could just be 2 characters in a room and just a dialogue back and forth be that riveting. All of the characters are fascinating. Gabriel Byrne's own therapy sessions with Diane Wiest are fascinating. Totally off topic, but how do you feel about that show as a therapist?
I have thoughts. I think it's pretty good. I do. And of course, there's a lot of things that are sensationalized and unrealistic.
It is, but it is a show.
But it's a show, of course. And even in that show, his performance is always so even-keeled with, like, some hints of, like, excitement sometimes. There's some hints of him, like, losing grip emotionally. And I think he had a very similar performance in Hereditary. And that's why I think it was completely deliberate. Like you said, if you even just look at a family structure, like, usually it's the patriarch of the family who's supposed to hold it together and be more subdued to not worry others, to not get others too excited. So I thought he played that role fantastically.
Gabriel Byrne is a really fantastically underrated actor. He's
Absolutely.
excellent in everything he's ever been, and I've always been a big fan, especially because of In Treatment. That show turned me into a huge Gabriel Byrne fan that now whenever I see him in anything, I get excited because of Paul Weston.
So, fun fact, since we're talking about In Treatment, his son in Treatment is Alex Wolff. He plays his son.
That's right. That's right.
So I was really excited to see that the first time I saw Hereditary.
I totally forgot about it, and I've seen that show a few times already.
Yep.
Wow. That must be cool for Alex Wolff. He gets to work with Gabriel Byrne so much.
Mm-hmm. And overshadowed him maybe the second time.
Very true. The second time he did.
Well, that was our number 2.
Yeah. Hereditary.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll cut off your genitals and feed them to your kids.
We did it, folks. We are now at the top of our list.
My number 1 is one of several on my list that were in my favorite of all time. So this has been a very important decade for me in horror.
I already know what it is, and I knew before you even crafted the list what your number 1 was going to be.
My favorite horror of the decade is The Conjuring 2, 2016. It's a perfect horror film. It's the best haunted house film I personally have ever seen. Other people might have their favorites, but this one's mine. And it's directed by James Wan, and it's by far his best work. Written by Chad and Carrie Hayes again, and also with some rewrites by James Wan and David Leslie Johnson, who did The Orphan. And Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga again are perfect as the Warrens. Madison Wolfe as Janet's really good in it. Frances O'Connor as Peggy, the mom. Simon McBurney as Maurice Gross, one of the investigators. One of the first investigators that investigated this case before the Warrens did. And Franca Potente as the skeptic from Run Lola Run. And great cinematography from Don Burgess. It's based in 1977 in North London. The Enfield Poltergeist. It's another even more effective period piece, I think, than The Conjuring was. I think it's even more emotionally engaging than the first one was. And the Warrens' connection is even stronger in this one. Phenomenal acting from both the stars, of course, and the supporting cast. It's one of the scariest films in the last 20 years. I nerded out on the opening sequence with the seance in Amityville and the Amityville Horror House featuring the boy from the now famous picture. It's extremely well done and creepy, well crafted. Phenomenal set design. 3 excellent and very scary horror characters in Bill Wilkins, the old man, the crooked man, and Valak the nun. And again, even less cursing and less sex than Sinister, but still rated R for content. and this time Juan wanted the rated R, and he got it. And it's you can see every bit of the rated R, even though it does not have cursing or sex in it. It feels like a rated R movie. And Vera Farmiga actually screamed so much that she suffered a swollen lymph node from the intense screaming. It is strange to me that the original investigators, because in the actual story, this is another one where James Swan kind of took liberties with the end of the story. There was some other investigators that originally, the Maurice Grosse and his team, originally investigated this house. So the Warrens only came in at the end, and they only stayed a few days. The family is indebted to them. They are grateful for them because they do believe that they did help them with this haunting. Valak the demon, and I've mentioned this before, it looked very much like a demon I saw before. I had an experience where I went into a supposedly haunted asylum, and I think I brought something back with me because I seen demons the next day while I was laying in bed, and I seen people sitting around my bed discussing how I needed to be put into an insane asylum. And I wasn't surprised to find out that Lorraine Warren had a lot to do with the design of Valak the Nun, but the original design of Valak the Nun is what you see at the end when it turns into a demon. That was the original design of it. It was not a nun. It was just a horrible, grotesque demon, and it looks exactly like one of the demons that I've seen. And
it's become so iconic too, so fast.
And that was a decision by James Wan, because he decided to make this disfigured demon into a nun to symbolize Lorraine Warren's having her faith tested. You know, supposed to be like sacrilegious and blasphemous.
All great qualities for a supernatural movie.
Yeah, so it had everything that I love about horror. I love how emotional it is. You really feel the connection of the Warrens, so, even more so in this one. I'm kind of worried about The Conjuring 3, because this one was so good. It's going to be hard to top it, and especially if James Wan stepped back and he's going to let the director of The Curse of La Llorona do it. I'm kind of worried about that, but let's see what they do with these characters. This is one of my favorite films of all time. It has everything I love about horror, and that's why The Conjuring 2 from 2016 is my number one.
I feel like this is a movie that you could you could use The Conjuring 2 to teach film classes, students, on how to use long camera takes for the sake of building unbearable suspense. Because there's some good jump scares in this movie, but what really makes it effective is the camera work, the moodiness of it. I prefer the aesthetic of The Conjuring 2 to the aesthetic of the first one. I like the darker look of it, and I like that there's more black in there. It puts me in a more uneasy state of mind than the original Conjuring does. And there's one scene that's really drawn out where we're waiting for a ball to return back after it's been passed down the hallway. Yeah. And the way that it just holds on it, the camera angles and everything, totally expert level of suspense building. Like from the beginning to the end, the level of craftsmanship in this movie is impeccable. Impeccable craftsmanship.
Yeah, and the way he uses the set, and you can't even tell it's a set through almost the whole thing. The only time that I could tell it's a set is when the camera moves across the ceiling between walls. And that's the only time you can tell it's a set. Other than that, it feels like a real location. And it makes me that much more excited to see the next film that James Wan is doing, because he's going to use all real locations, and he's not going to be on a soundstage this time.
It'll be interesting to see, because we know he's going to be scaling back.
Yeah. So I'm definitely more excited about the new original James Wan movie than I am about The Conjuring 3, sadly. But we'll see.
One of my favorite reviews for The Conjuring 2 says, turns out what Ed and Lorraine Warren were really conjuring was unconditional love and devotion. Nice. So that's really what I took from this film too, is I love how they examined their relationship more than anything, and how they really developed those characters within the context of the relationship. I thought that was great.
Yeah, it's a genuinely touching love story on top of everything else that it is.
My number one is The Witch from 2015, Robert Eggers. There's no horror film that scared me as much as The Witch. This was a very easy decision for me to come by, because like I said earlier, when Sergio mentioned it and when Michael mentioned it, It's one of the very few movies where I actually got the feeling that what I was watching was actually evil. It didn't feel like a simulation or a representation of evil, like it just was evil. The world is alien and unwelcoming and very foreign, but at the same time it's very, very realistic, and the fidelity to the authenticity of the period really helps to sell that what you're seeing is actually happening. The isolated setting in the forest plunges the viewer headfirst into its atmosphere. It has a lot of my favorite pure horror imagery of any film from the decade. I'm thinking of particularly one of the scenes that some people think it's funny, but I think it's really disturbing, and it was really jarred me the first time I saw it, is the scene with the mom where she believes that she is breastfeeding her dead child, and you realize that it is a black crow pecking at her breast. Really, really got under my skin. All of the scares in the movie, all of the suspense felt really, I don't know how to put it, where I was scared, but I was almost delighted that the movie was scaring me as much as it was, where it almost got me excited, where I was like, I feel goosebumps right now, the hair is standing up on the back of my neck, and I'm freaked out, and I feel like I shouldn't be watching this. I feel like I'm watching something unholy. But isn't it awesome to see a filmmaker really put me into that frame of mind? I felt like I was in there with that family being haunted. I didn't really particularly relate to the family, and most of them are not entirely likable people. But because the setting of the movie and the atmosphere is so overwhelming that despite their unlikability, they become endearing to you just because it would be terrible to have to go through that situation. The score is fucking phenomenal. Amazing score that really helps to jack up the tension, to get under your skin, to make the blood run cold. It's an absolute masterpiece from start to finish. Every shot is perfect. Every moment is perfect. Another interesting thing that Robert Eggers did, all of the scenes that have supernatural occurrences, like Caleb's Encounter of the Witch or Catherine's Dream of Caleb, are shot at a higher frame rate, 27 FPS, as opposed to the usual 24 frames per second. They put 27 frames per second, and it kind of helps to heighten the more fantastic elements of the movie. I need to go back because I didn't find out until recently that Robert Eggers has dropped clues that some of it might be in people's and the heads of the characters, and I didn't really find that out until I started researching it for this podcast. So when I watch it again, I'm going to watch it with a completely different point of view. I've shown this movie to so many people, and everybody I've ever shown it to walks away scared shitless by it. I had a couple of people tell me, why did you show me that? That was so awful. That was so evil. It was so wrong. That's why I showed it to you. That's why I showed it to you. Anna Joy Taylor, well, I do think that the acting of Hereditary is still better than The Witch. Mm-hmm. This is still top-notch acting across the board. Anna Joy Taylor, we need to see her in a lot more films, and we saw her in Split, and she was also really good in that. Mm-hmm. I want to see more of her as an actress. The scene with the little boy as they're performing that ritual while he's possessed that we were discussing earlier, there's no other scene in horror movies that get under my skin the way that does. And I think the part of it is seeing something so blasphemous and sacrilegious happening to an innocent child is extremely disturbing. The way that the twins fall to the ground when they're unable to play, when they're unable to pray, the music that's playing while they're doing it, the reactions of the mother and father are so realistic. When he spits out that apple that comes out of that looks really bloody, that you could tell that he just spit it out whole. When I first saw it, I was like recoiling from the screen and so uncomfortable. And when it was over, I was like, that was fucking shocking. That is, for me, the most expertly staged horror scene of the 2010s. There's no jump scares in this movie, and it is scary as hell. And I think a lot of horror fans hate this because there's no jump scares and there's no lead up to any jump scares. It's just the general vibe of the movie feels evil through the whole way through. You get a general sense of something very wrong with what you're watching. It perfectly captures the era. It was inspired by a lot of folk tales, fairy tales, and written accounts of historical witchcraft, including journals, diaries, and court records. And the dialogue comes directly from period sources, so everything in this movie is accurate. Like I mentioned earlier, the house was built using the same materials and the same process that a house back in that era, how it would have been built. The cinematographer shot the film almost with all natural light, like Michael mentioned earlier, and it really helps to sell the setting of the movie, the sense of isolation that you get in the movie. I love the parallels with Carrie as far as Anna Joy Taylor's character, and it also has my favorite ending in any horror movie of the 2010s. And the reason I like the ending is because it seems like it comes out of left field, but because so much of the horror of the movie is so bleak and so depressing and frightening, and like I said earlier, the film feels evil to me. For it to have such a messed up ending where it's about giving into evil only lends the film an even creepier quality that by the end of it, you're like, nothing's right, nothing's fine. In fact, things are probably going to get a lot worse, and evil reigns supreme. Great horror ending. Haunting, scary, mesmerizing, and for me, I know a lot of people say it's a slow burn. I'm riveted every time I watch it. Like from the very beginning all the way to the very end, it never bores me at all. And I understand for a lot of people this movie is boring. Some people can't get past the archaic dialogue, and I'll admit I don't understand everything they're saying perfectly, but I understand enough to understand the story, and I think that's what's important. I don't think it's important for you to get every little single thing that they're saying perfectly. So long as you get the general idea, that's enough for the movie to work. So for me, there's no other horror movie that impressed me, scared me, and gave me chills as much as The Witch. It is a perfect piece of filmmaking. It's one of my favorite movies of the decade period, one of my favorite movies overall. And I was completely blown away by it when I first seen it. I knew I had seen one of the scariest things I'd ever seen in my life. Kind of similar to the feeling that I got with Hereditary, but this scares me even more because it feels more genuinely evil. Even though it does have strong traumatic emotions, though not as strong as Hereditary, the supernatural elements are so overwhelming that it kind of just floored me. For all these reasons, so much more, The Witch is my favorite film, my favorite horror film of the 2010s. Masterpiece, 10 out of 10.
It's amazing, and what I love too about like Anna Taylor-Joy's performance is you see throughout the film she's being broken down by her family, to where at the end it's like she's left completely vulnerable, completely open, and completely impressionable. So I think that's what like leads up to the ending, which seemingly comes out of nowhere, but again, upon rewatch, you could see how it's gradually coming.
I feel like the witches in the movie were targeting the daughter because they were able to recognize the situation and the way that the family was reacting to her. And it was just a situation that was ripe to exploit, where like she would be easy to get on our side because her family are religious freaks. They don't trust her. They're very suspicious of her. They are scared of her womanhood. They're scared of her becoming a woman, which is kind of also parallel to Carrie. So it's only natural that it ends the way they did, almost like the movie. Throughout the entire film, they had designs on that character, and in order to get to her, they had to get rid of the rest of the family first, turn them against her, and put her into a point where what else would she do after the movie? Yeah. Her family completely turned on her. They're all dead. Everything went wrong. She has nothing to look forward to. She can't go back to the village where she came from, or she's going to be banished. Where else is she going to go?
Evil is very opportunistic.
Yeah, and they just swept in and took her right there. Amazing.
I'm not sure why I didn't mention this earlier, but even when I first saw Midsommar, I was reminiscent of the same thing, how this woman was completely isolated, had nowhere to go, had no one to support her, and this other group embraced her and brought her in. Yeah. So far to where no one agrees with me on this, but I think that in the film, switching to Midsommar real quick, I think I forget the friend who's from there, I believe he had something to do with the death of her parents and her sister to isolate her. And
kind of the way the witches
exactly
stirred up the situation in The Witch.
Exactly, so that's why I'm bringing it up now. I think the same thing was going on. Like you said, they saw this opportunity and they took it. And it's not so much just evil being opportunistic that way, but just groups of people. So you talk about cults, you talk about religions, you talk about any type of group who maybe wants to look for the most vulnerable to increase their members.
That is cult mentality.
Yeah.
They always, cults, gangs, psychotic religions. i.e. Scientology.
Yeah.
Hope we don't get attacked for that.
Uh-oh.
They seem to prey on vulnerable people because those are people who are more susceptible to brainwashing.
Yeah, like when I first moved out here from Mississippi, for the first year or so, I would get approached by Scientologists all the time. I actually got approached by 2 different cults. One of them
Wow.
kept contacting me and they painted themselves as if they were a hippie commune. And we all just sit around all day. And
Oh
play
shit,
music together.
Midsommar.
Yep, here it comes.
And then once I became hardened to the lifestyle out here in the big city, no one approaches me at all.
They wanted to make you their May Queen, Michael.
I was a green little redneck boy.
The Pickle Prince.
And you could have had you could have been adorned with gorgeous flowers, Michael.
I know.
You missed your chance.
That would be.
All right, so
What was your number one?
that brings me to my number one. My number one's from 2019, directed by Tom Hooper. It's the movie Cats. I'm just totally kidding.
Oh shit! I thought you were serious. I was gonna be like, what?
I was trying to process.
It took me a second. I was like, what?
So, okay, real quick on Cats. I'm sorry I'm doing this. This is a film we got to take James to watch at the Alamo Draft House. I went to the rowdy screening, and it was hilarious. It was just everyone's reaction.
Should I get
to it.
high before watching it?
I mean, yeah, sure.
Okay.
When I went, they had drink specials, and the drink specials were served in milk bowls. And you had to, like, it was the worst thing ever, but the funniest thing ever. But anyway, no, it's not Cats.
Okay.
All right. So my number one is kind of a surprise to me as well, as I just couldn't get this out of my head. I know when I saw Hereditary, I became obsessed with it. I had to consume everything that had to do with it. I listened to any podcast that discussed it. I had to read all about it, and I became obsessed with it in that way. But this film kind of stuck with me in a different way, where I didn't want to know anything else about it. I just wanted to take it in as an experience to try to decipher it for myself. And that's from 2016. It's The Wailing, directed by Na Hong Jin.
Okay. I have never seen your number one choice, and I feel totally left out of the loop now.
Damn
it.
I honestly think that might have been part of the reason why it was so high for me, is that I want everyone to watch it, because I know not everyone has, a lot of people haven't, but I loved it. It's a slim 156 minutes, and you feel every moment of it. But let me get into the synopsis real quick. So the tagline is "Never be tempted." A stranger arrives in a little village, and soon after, a mysterious sickness starts spreading. A policeman is drawn into the incident and is forced to solve the mystery in order to save his daughter. So this film just drags you in. It hypnotizes you, and it deceives you. So this is another one where throughout the film, I think I know what's going on, and then something totally different happens that changes my perception of it. And I think that's what I really like about it. It's a South Korean film. And in the film, the police officer who's investigating this town that was decimated by this disease finds himself like in the middle of it, where he sees the village. There's apparently in the village, all these people started developing a rash. The sickness was getting worse, and then it like devolved into mayhem and like mass murders and people killing each other. So like in the middle of this hysteria, they see this stranger who's Japanese, so no one knows who he is. He has glowing red eyes, and they see him eating a deer. So this Japanese stranger becomes like suspect number one. So they go to his house, and they're investigating, and in the house, the investigator sees his daughter's shoe. And after this, his daughter starts manifesting symptoms of this sickness that happens. I don't really want to give away much more than that, but I just love the way that, again, this is something that's driven by like a love for his daughter, and he evokes the help of this like medicine man who is a great character too. And every time they think they've like gained an inch on what's going on, something happens and they're completely lost once again. So that's what I really loved about this film. That's what a lot of people criticize it for. There's a lot of people criticize it for not having like a cohesive plot. A lot of people criticize it for really not being able to follow it all the time. But I love the way it was able to confuse me. I love the way it was able to like make me doubt myself the entire time.
So in other words, this is going to piss off a lot of horror fans.
Absolutely. I think you've seen I like the more quote unquote elevated horror.
So do I. Mike and I both love horror movies that half the horror community hates, divisive horror movies. Those are the ones that tend to be my favorite ones.
I think you can call me a fart sniffer because that's what they call us, right?
Really?
Yeah, like, well, so this is another thing. Another thing we've talked about, like 2018, you had Hereditary and then you had Terrifier. You could love both. I'm sure the three of us love both, but this was like the division where people were on one side or the other. Yeah. And they're like, oh, those fart sniffers who love Hereditary, blah, blah, blah.
I will say this. I love Hereditary and I love Terrifier. Terrifier was made my list of that year of the top 10 horror movies of 2018. I think it's a perfect recreation of an 80s slasher brought to life. I think it's fun and I think it's a blast. But I got to be honest here, those movies are not on the same level as something like Hereditary and The Witch. And to be fair, I don't expect them to be. Mm-hmm. So it's not like that's not even a criticism because I like it for what it's supposed to be. And while I definitely gravitate towards elevated horror, as they like to call it, which is kind of a stupid name anyway.
Yeah.
I love B-movie horror. I loved trashy slashers. I like all of it. It's just I like quality, so I'm always going to be drawn to films that are of a higher quality.
Same, and I love Terrifier as a showcase of like cool gore, a showcase of like fun scenes, but like as like a cohesive film, like it doesn't really do a lot for me. So that's why like I do love these films more and call it elevated horror, call it whatever, but I think I'm just a fan of good film. Like it's not just horror. I can name you. Well, I'm just more interested in anything that's new, anything that makes me think, anything that kind of impacts me emotionally. Like I think you've got the sense from here, and that's like from this film, from The Wailing, it's something that made me doubt myself.
I like movies that push the art form of filmmaking itself into new directions or to unexpected directions, and I like movies that play with my expectations, and I like movies that deliberately go out of their way not to satisfy me or not cater to me.
And I'd rather be deeply affected than I would have a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So now that I'm like talking about it and vocalizing it, I think I'm more understanding why this might be my number one, because it's kind of everything I've liked this decade wrapped into one. It's South Korean. We've had great foreign horror films. It's one of those elevated horror films that has great...
South Korea is fucking flourishing as a country, the filmmaking. Totally off. Have you seen Parasite?
Oh, yes.
Oh, that's an incredible movie. Michael needs to see it. Yeah. Totally deserving of all its praise.
Oof. I got the blue. I'll bring it over.
Cool.
But yeah, and this film is similar. It's amazing cinematography. It's so well shot. The acting is great. The story is something. The story is something that makes me guess and keeps me guessing. There's twist after twist, and I think that's what I've liked about this decade. So I like that people have been able to take these bold shots and land them.
I think this is the best decade of horror, and I've said it a few times on this podcast with Michael, since the 1980s.
Yeah.
Horror has never been this good, and I feel like the quantity and the quality is off the charts. Like I feel like, I mean, people always are nostalgic for The Exorcist and The Shining, and rightfully so, and Rosemary's Baby, and I worship those movies too. I feel like horror movies of that quality are being made at a much faster rate now than they were when they were back then.
Well, they were rare back then.
They were rare back then. And, well, I get a lot of people in the early 2000s. For me, 2000 to 2009, that decade, well, there's a lot I love about it, and there's a lot of great stuff. Probably my least favorite decade of horror, if I have to go down to it. I like 90s horror more, 80s horror more, 70s horror, even going back in 60s and 50s horror. This decade felt like a huge rebound in terms of the originality, the quality, and the quantity. It's fucking absurd, and I feel like horror has become a more respected genre, particularly in the last 6 or 7 years. I mean, the whole decade was strong, but I feel like somewhere around 2014, the horror genre just kicked into high gear, and it's never looked back since.
Yeah. And I think previously the genre was a mosaic, where Italians make films this way, Koreans make films this way, Japanese filmmakers make films this way, where now it's more integrative. Now people are integrating ideas and styles across cultures from different nations, and that's why I think audiences are more open to foreign films now. And that's why Parasite won Best Picture. And that's why we have Tiger's Not Afraid being one of like the favorite films on Shudder right now.
And you know what? I know this kind of took Michael back. I loved Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's an amazing movie. And there was a part of me that's rooting for it, but I can't even I'm not even the least bit bothered by Parasite winning because it's fucking deserving of it.
Same.
I have no complaints about it.
Same. Michael's heard my 30-minute rant about how much I love Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, I think Parasite's so deserving, and I'm so excited that we're just so open to foreign film. And I love what Bong Joon-ho said at, what was it, the Golden Globes? That once you get over that 1 inch of subtitles, you'll discover great cinema.
Oh, hell yeah.
How amazing was that?
And also because, obviously, and I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, the U.S. is the best country for films.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question about that. But I feel like if you're a film fan or horror fan or anybody's into film or horror, you're really limiting yourself if you're only watching American films, because different cultures have different things that you'd never see in an American film. Like, the Asian horror films are creepy in a way that American horror films cannot quite get at. It's things that are unique to Asian culture. Mexican horror films have a quality that American films don't have. French films are another one that have a quality that you can't get in terms of the way that they push boundaries, the extremism. It's just a lot of stuff that you wouldn't see in American movies. So get over it, people.
Yeah.
Who gives a fuck about subtitles? I mean, just, they're not a big deal. And once you get sucked into a great foreign film, you don't even notice the subtitles anymore.
Yeah.
I don't even notice it either. And it's weird because I start to hear, obviously, even if I don't speak the language and I'm reading the subtitles as going along, I feel like I'm hearing it come out and I understand it, even though I don't.
And even like, because I'm a big music nerd too, and if I really love a band, I like to know who their influences are, and I listen to those bands, and that's how I discover new things. And all our favorite filmmakers now are influenced by foreign film, are influenced by, films in other nations. Like, you look at like Bone Tomahawk, it seems like a straight Western, and then it seems like an Italian cannibal film. So that's
It's a hybrid.
Yeah, and that's how we get the genre blending. That's how we get the hybrids. And I think I would be missing a lot if I was more apprehensive about watching foreign film. And just adding that just adds so much to my enjoyment of the genre and all genres.
Horror show exclusive.
Well, Sergio, I'd like to thank you very much for coming in. We've had a blast with you here, and we get along really great. And as you can hear now, we could probably go on talking the rest of the night. But this has been
Which we probably will.
Yeah.
Once stops recording.
This has been a very long podcast, and we hope you guys enjoyed it. We enjoyed it, recording it quite a bit. And we're definitely going to have Sergio back, and we're going to talk about how horror films affect the psyche, and we're going to talk about a few horror films that have to do with that. And while we were talking, I kind of thought about a movie, The Fourth Kind. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have.
So we definitely got to go into that one the next time, because it's about people who the horror comes from through the therapy sessions. So that's kind of the way it unfolds. So it'd be something very interesting to talk about next time. And I'm going to try to get another special guest in here. I won't say her name because it might not happen, but I'm really going to try to get another special guest in there to discuss that with us.
Wink, wink.
So check us out on Instagram at Pickles Horror Show, and you'll find all the information about all of our upcoming podcasts, about our TV show on American Horrors, and about our feature film coming out this year, Pay Up. So at Pickles Horror Show on Instagram, on Facebook.com/Pickles Horror Show.
Until next week, folks, happy horror.
Yes.